Then you'll eat beside me from now on. When a dying widow's last scrap of pride meets a stranger's unexpected mercy, everything changes. Montana, 1875. 3 starving children, an empty larder, a mother choosing death over shame. Then a cowboy knocks, asking only for water, but what he offers instead will either save them all or destroy what little dignity they have left. Stay with me until the end, and comment which city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wind that swept across the Montana Territory in the winter of 1875 carried no mercy. It howled through the cracks in Nora Whitfield's cabin walls like the voice of something ancient and hungry, rattling the windows in their frames and stealing what little warmth the dying fire offered. Outside, the world was a canvas of white and gray, snow-crusted plains stretching endlessly beneath a sky the color of old pewter. Inside, Nora stood before her kitchen shelves and confronted a truth that had been creeping closer for months. They were running out of everything. Not just food, not just firewood or lamp oil, or the dozen other necessities that kept a homestead alive through a brutal winter. They were running out of time, running out of hope, running out of reasons to believe tomorrow would be any different from today. Her hands trembled as she reached for the last jar of preserved beans, the very last one, sitting alone on a shelf that had once groaned under the weight of her careful preparations. Sarah Whitfield had taught her daughter well. "A prudent woman keeps a year's worth stored," she'd said, back when Nora was young and the future seemed infinite. But Sarah had never been a widow at 28, with 3 children and a ranch drowning in debt. Sarah had never had to choose between buying seed for spring planting or feeding her babies through one more week of winter. The jar felt impossibly light in Nora's hands. She turned it slowly, watching the beans shift inside. Not enough for a proper meal, barely enough for a thin soup if she stretched it with water, and the last handful of barley. Behind her, the cook stove ticked and pinged as it cooled, its belly empty of fuel. She'd burned the last of the split wood that morning. Tomorrow she'd have to start breaking up furniture or venture out to the woodpile that David had left half-finished before. No, she wouldn't think about David. Not now. Not when she needed to stay strong. "Mama?" The small voice came from the doorway, thin and uncertain. "Mama? Is it supper time?" Nora turned to see her youngest, Emma, hovering at the threshold of the kitchen. 5 years old, all bones and wide blue eyes in a face that had grown gaunt over the long winter. The little girl clutched a rag doll that had been her Christmas present, the only Christmas present any of them had received, and watched her mother with the terrible patience of children who have learned not to ask for too much. "Soon, sweetheart," Nora managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Go tell your brother and sister to wash up." Emma nodded and disappeared, her bare feet padding softly across the wooden floor. Bare feet in February. Nora's throat tightened. The girl's shoes had worn through in December, and there was no money for new ones. There was no money for anything. The bank draft that had arrived last week sat like a coiled snake on the mantelpiece, a polite reminder that Mr. Josiah Kemp of the First Bank of Helena expected payment on the mortgage by the end of March, or the property would be forfeit. Never mind that David had died in November, his lungs destroyed by the pneumonia that swept through the valley like divine judgment. Never mind that she'd sold everything that wasn't nailed down, David's saddle, his rifle, even her mother's silver candlesticks, just to keep the children fed through December. The bank didn't care about widows or orphans. The bank cared about money, and Nora Whitfield had none. She opened the jar of beans and dumped them into a pot, added water from the bucket by the door, water she'd hauled from the creek that morning, breaking through a skim of ice to reach it, and set it on the stove to warm, not cook. There wasn't enough heat for that, just warm enough that the children might not notice they were eating cold soup again. The cabin door burst open and her son Thomas stumbled inside, his arms loaded with 3 small logs. At 11, he was trying desperately to be the man of the house, and the weight of that responsibility sat visibly on his thin shoulders. His coat, David's old coat, cut down and still too large, was dusted with snow, and his cheeks were bright red with cold. "Found these behind the barn, Mama," he said, trying to sound triumphant and failing. They both knew those logs were green wood, barely seasoned, and would smoke more than burn. "Thought maybe we could—" That's good, Thomas. Thank you. Nora took the logs from him, feeling how cold his hands were even through her own chapped fingers. Go warm yourself by the fire. I'll get supper ready. It's just beans again, isn't it? Her middle child, 10-year-old Rebecca, appeared in the doorway with Emma in tow. Rebecca had her father's dark hair and serious eyes, and lately she'd started looking at Nora with an expression that was far too knowing for a child. Mama, you haven't eaten all day. I watched. I had some bread at breakfast, Nora lied smoothly. The bread had gone to the children. I'm fine, Becca. Don't fuss. You're lying. Rebecca's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. You always lie about eating. You think we don't notice, but we do. The words hung in the cold air between them. Nora wanted to snap at her daughter, to send her away with sharp words about respecting her elders. But what was the point? Rebecca was right. She had been lying. For weeks now, Nora had been giving her own portions to the children, telling herself she could manage on less, that she was stronger, that mothers were meant to sacrifice. But her body was starting to betray her. Dizzy spells when she stood too quickly, a bone-deep exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch. And yesterday, for the first time, she'd noticed her hand shaking when she tried to thread a needle. Everybody gets some tonight, Nora said firmly, stirring the watery beans. Everybody eats. That's final. But even as she said it, she was calculating. If she divided the beans 4 ways, the children would still go to bed hungry. If she divided them 3 ways and claimed she wasn't hungry again, Thomas fed the green logs into the stove, and acrid smoke began to curl out around the edges of the door. The boy coughed, but said nothing, his jaw set in a way that reminded Nora painfully of David. Rebecca gathered Emma onto her lap in the rocking chair and began to hum something low and tuneless, a lullaby without words. The sound of it made Nora want to weep. This was what it had come to. This was what they'd been reduced to, ghosts in their own home, going through the motions of living while slowly starving to death in a land that had promised them everything and delivered nothing but hardship. David had been so sure when they came here 5 years ago, so full of dreams about the ranch they'd build, the life they'd make. Montana Territory is the future, he'd said, his eyes bright with conviction. We'll have cattle and horses, Nora. We'll have land as far as the eye can see. Our children will inherit something real. But the reality had been harder than the dream. The winters were brutal, the summers scorching. Disease took their livestock, drought killed their crops, and the debt mounted steadily until it became a weight that even David's stubborn optimism couldn't bear. And then he died, and Nora was left alone with 3 children and a failing ranch and a question she couldn't answer. What came next? She ladled the thin soup into 4 bowls, 4 equal portions, because she couldn't bear Rebecca's knowing eyes, and called the children to the table. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin bowls and the wind howling outside. Nora forced herself to swallow every spoonful, though her stomach had long since forgotten how to feel hunger properly. Now there was only a hollow ache, a constant presence she'd learned to ignore. When the bowls were empty, Thomas carefully stacked them to wash later, when there was enough fire to heat water, and the children retreated to the corner where they slept together now, conserving warmth. Rebecca and Emma curled up under the quilts that Nora's mother had made, while Thomas lay down nearby, still wearing his coat. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed them all, and their breathing settled into the deep rhythm of sleep. Nora sat alone at the table, her head in her hands, and finally let the tears come. Silent tears that she couldn't afford, tears that changed nothing and solved nothing, but that she couldn't hold back anymore. She cried for David, for the dreams they'd buried with him. She cried for her children, who deserved so much more than this slow starvation. And she cried for herself, for the woman she'd been before Montana, young and hopeful and certain that love and hard work could overcome anything. How foolish she'd been. The knock, when it came, was so unexpected that Nora nearly screamed. Her head jerked up, eyes wide in the dimness. It was past dark. No one traveled this late, not in winter, not in weather like this. For a wild moment, she thought perhaps it was Silas Crow, the wealthy rancher who'd been circling her property like a vulture for months, making increasingly insulting offers to buy her out. Or maybe it was Mr. Kemp from the bank, come personally to deliver more bad news. The knock came again, firmer this time. Patient but insistent. Nora stood on shaking legs and moved to the door, her heart hammering. Through the small window, she could see the shadow of a man, broad-shouldered, hat pulled low. She hesitated, her hand on the latch, remembering all of David's warnings about strangers and drifters and the kind of men who wandered the territory looking for easy prey. A woman alone with 3 children was about as easy as prey got. But standing here afraid wouldn't change anything. Nora lifted the latch and opened the door a crack, keeping her weight braced against it in case she needed to slam it shut quickly. The man on her doorstep was a cowboy. That much was immediately clear. Dust-covered despite the snow, wearing canvas pants tucked into worn boots, a leather coat that had seen better years, and a broad-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. When he looked up at the sound of the door opening, Nora saw he was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, maybe less, with several days of beard on his jaw and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. His eyes were gray or maybe blue. It was hard to tell in the poor light, and they regarded her with something that wasn't quite apologetic, but wasn't threatening either. "Evening, ma'am." His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in a while. "Sorry to trouble you this late. I saw your light from the road and thought maybe I could trouble you for some water, for my horse and myself." "I'll pay for it." Nora glanced past him and saw a rangy buckskin gelding tied to her fence post, its head hanging low with exhaustion. The horse looked as worn as its rider, ribby, tired, covered in the pale dust of long miles. Her first instinct was to refuse, to send this stranger back into the night where he belonged. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way he'd asked, polite, direct, without presumption. Maybe it was the fact that he'd offered to pay for water, as if he understood poverty intimately enough to know that nothing was free. Or maybe it was simply that his exhaustion was so visible, so complete, that it called to something in her own bone-deep weariness. "Water's free," she heard herself say. "Wait here." She closed the door, not all the way, but enough to make it clear she wasn't inviting him inside, and went to fill a tin cup from the bucket. Her hands were shaking again. What was she doing? She didn't know this man. He could be anyone, a thief, a murderer, a man who'd see her vulnerability and exploit it. But when she returned to the door and handed him the cup, he took it with a nod of thanks and drank deeply, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. Then he poured the rest into his hat and offered it to his horse, who drank gratefully. "Much obliged, ma'am." He handed the empty cup back to her. "That's kind of you." He should have left then. That was the natural end to the transaction. Water given, thanks expressed, stranger back on his way. But instead, he stood there for a moment, his eyes moving past Nora to take in what little he could see of the cabin interior. She saw his gaze catch on the children sleeping in the corner, on the empty pot on the stove, on the barren shelves visible through the kitchen doorway. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in his face shifted, a subtle tightening around his eyes, a press of his lips. "You alone out here, ma'am?" The question was quiet, careful. "Just you and the children?" Nora's spine stiffened. "My husband's just out checking the stock," she lied, the words automatic. Never admit weakness. Never admit vulnerability. "He'll be back shortly." The cowboy nodded slowly, but his eyes said he didn't believe her. There was no judgment in his face, though, just a kind of weary recognition, as if he'd seen this scene before and knew exactly what it meant. He glanced back at his horse, then at Nora again, and she saw him make some kind of decision. "Ma'am, I've got supplies in my saddlebags, more than I need for myself." He said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather. "Bacon, coffee, some flour and beans. I'd be grateful if you'd take some off my hands. Horse is carrying too heavy, and I've got another 2 days to Fort Benton. I'd pay you to take it, but I suspect you won't accept money." The lie was so transparent, so carefully constructed to preserve her dignity, that Nora felt something crack inside her chest. This stranger, this unnamed cowboy who owed her nothing, was trying to help her. Not with pity, not with charity that would sting like acid on her pride, but with a lie so gentle it was almost a kindness in itself. She should refuse. She should send him away and bolt the door and pretend this moment had never happened. But behind her, Emma whimpered in her sleep, the sound of a hungry child dreaming, and Nora felt her resolve crumble like ash. "I can't pay you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have money." "Didn't ask for money, ma'am. Asked you to help lighten my horse's load." He tipped his hat slightly. "If you want to repay it someday, you can do the same for someone else who needs it. That's payment enough." Nora stepped back from the door, her throat too tight for words, and watched as the cowboy moved to his horse and began unbuckling his saddlebags. He worked quickly, efficiently, pulling out wrapped parcels and canvas sacks that he carried to the doorstep. Bacon wrapped in paper, a sack of flour that must have weighed 10 pounds, coffee beans in a tin, dried beans, even a small jar of honey, precious as gold. "Had this honey from a trader in Virginia City," he said, setting it carefully on the growing pile. "But I don't have much taste for sweet things. Seemed ashamed to waste it." Another lie, Nora thought distantly. Another careful, deliberate lie, designed to let her keep her dignity while accepting help she desperately needed. She wanted to thank him, to tell him what this meant, but the words lodged in her throat like stones. Instead, she watched in silence as he made 3 trips from horse to doorstep, building a small mountain of supplies that represented more wealth than she'd seen in months. When he was finished, he stepped back and picked up his hat, which he'd set aside while working. "Well, that's that. That's much obliged for the water, ma'am, and for the help with the horse." "Wait." Nora's voice came out rougher than she intended. "What's your name? I should know. I should know who to thank." The cowboy hesitated, like he was considering whether names mattered in this moment. Then he said simply, "Luke Barrett, ma'am. Headed north looking for ranch work. Heard there might be something up in Fort Benton." "I'm Nora Whitfield." She gestured vaguely at the cabin behind her, encompassing the whole sorry situation with one tired motion. "Was my husband's ranch. He passed in November. It's just me and the children now." Luke nodded, his face grave. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Whitfield." He settled his hat back on his head, tugged it into place. "You take care of yourself and those young ones. Winter's hard, but spring always comes." He was turning to leave, one boot already in the stirrup, when Nora heard herself say, "Wait, please." Luke paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. "Have you eaten tonight?" The question tumbled out before she could stop it. "I mean, it's not much, but if you wanted to warm yourself before you ride on, you'd be welcome to some stew. I was just about to make some with—" She gestured helplessly at the supplies he'd just given her. "With what you brought." It was insane, she knew. She should be hustling this man off her property, not inviting him to linger. But something in her rebelled against letting him disappear into the night. This stranger who'd shown her more kindness in 5 minutes than she'd received in 5 months. And perhaps, too, there was the selfish hunger for adult company, for a conversation that wasn't about rationing or debt, or where the next meal was coming from. Luke studied her for a long moment, and Nora saw the calculation in his eyes. He knew what she was doing, repaying his kindness with the only thing she had to offer, a hot meal and a warm fire. He also knew, she suspected, that accepting the invitation meant something, created an obligation, or perhaps just a connection that might complicate the clean simplicity of his good deed. But then he smiled, just a little, and swung back down from his horse. "That's mighty kind of you, Mrs. Whitfield. I'd be grateful for a hot meal before I ride on. It's been a long day, and I confess I'm tired to my bones." Nora nodded, something loosening in her chest, and stepped back to let him in. "You can tie your horse to the rail there. There's hay in the barn. Not much, but you're welcome to it. Come inside when you're ready." She closed the door and stood for a moment in the dim cabin, staring at the pile of supplies that had appeared like manna from heaven. Then, moving almost mechanically, she began to work. She stoked the fire with one of Thomas's logs, added more precious fuel from the wood box. There would be enough now, thanks to Luke Barrett. There would be enough. And watched as real flames began to lick up through the grate. She opened the flour and the beans, unwrapped the bacon, and began to assemble a real meal, a proper meal, the kind she hadn't cooked in so long she'd almost forgotten how. The scent of frying bacon brought Thomas awake first. His head popped up from the quilts, eyes wide and confused, nostrils flaring. "Mama?" he said uncertainly, like he thought he might be dreaming. "Is that—" "It's bacon, Thomas." Nora stirred the pot, watching fat melt and sizzle. "We're having a proper supper tonight. But how—" Rebecca was sitting up now, too, Emma stirring in her lap. "Mama, where did you get food?" Before Nora could answer, there was a soft knock at the door. Luke Barrett, respectful enough to announce himself, even though she'd invited him in. Nora wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door to find him standing there, hat in hand, his face and hands freshly washed. Up close, in the firelight, she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, closer to her own age, with fine lines around his eyes that spoke more of squinting into sun and wind than age. "Come in, Mr. Barrett," Nora said, stepping aside. "Children, this is Mr. Luke Barrett. He's a traveler heading north, and he's been kind enough to share his supplies with us. In return, we're sharing our table." 3 pairs of eyes fixed on Luke with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Thomas stood up, drawing himself to his full height, barely came to Luke's chest, and stuck out his hand with determined formality. "Thomas Whitfield, sir. Pleased to meet you." Luke shook the boy's hand gravely, matching his seriousness. "Pleasure's mine, Thomas. Fine grip you've got there." Rebecca and Emma were more hesitant, but Luke didn't push. He simply nodded to them with the same courtesy he'd shown Nora, then moved to the far side of the room, near the fire, but not so close as to intrude on the children's space. He settled onto a bench there, long legs stretched out, and watched as Nora finished preparing the meal. It was strange, having a man in the house again. Not uncomfortable exactly, but strange. The cabin felt different with Luke Barrett's presence. Smaller somehow, but also warmer, more alive. He didn't fill the space the way David had, with constant motion and noise and plans. Instead, he simply existed there, quiet and solid, like a piece of furniture that had always belonged. When the stew was ready, rich with bacon fat and thick with beans, more luxurious than anything they'd eaten in months, Nora ladled it into bowls and handed them around. Luke accepted his with a quiet thank you and waited until everyone else was served before taking a bite. The children needed no such prompting. They fell on their food with desperate hunger barely restrained by manners, shoveling in spoonful after spoonful like they were afraid it might disappear. Nora watched them eat and felt tears prick her eyes again. When was the last time she'd seen them like this? Not picking listlessly at inadequate portions, but actually eating, actually satisfied. Emma's eyes were half closed in bliss. Rebecca was smiling despite herself, and even serious Thomas looked young again, his face relaxing as his belly filled. "Good stew, Mrs. Whitfield," Luke said quietly. "You've got a talent with a cookpot." "It's just beans and bacon," Nora replied, but she felt absurdly pleased by the compliment anyway. "Nothing fancy. Sometimes plain is best." Luke scraped his bowl clean and set it aside. "My mother used to say that hunger was the best seasoning, but I think you'd make a fine meal regardless." Conversation came easier after that, flowing in the way it does when stomachs are full and the fire is warm. Luke told them about his travels, carefully edited stories, Nora suspected, leaving out the hardship and danger in favor of humor and interesting details. He spoke of seeing buffalo herds that stretched to the horizon, of riding through mountain passes where the snow was 10 feet deep, of towns springing up overnight wherever gold or silver was rumored. The children listened with rapt attention, even Emma staying awake far past her usual bedtime. In return, Nora found herself talking about the ranch, about David's dreams for it, about the struggles they'd faced. She found herself being more honest than she'd intended, the words spilling out like water from a cracked dam. Maybe it was the food or the warmth or simply the fact that Luke Barrett was a stranger who'd be gone by morning. Sometimes it was easier to tell truths to people who wouldn't be around to see you live with the consequences. "So you see," she finished, gesturing around the shabby cabin, "this is what's left. A dying ranch, 3 children, and a banknote coming due in 6 weeks that I have no way to pay." Luke was quiet for a long moment, his face thoughtful in the firelight. Then he said carefully, "You thought about taking on help? Ranch hand, I mean. Someone to get things running again before spring planting." Nora laughed, a bitter sound. "With what money, Mr. Barrett? I can barely feed my children, let alone pay wages to a hired man." "What if wages weren't the point?" Luke leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his expression serious now. "What if it was a partnership? I help you get the ranch running again, fix fences, tend what cattle you've got left, get crops planted, and in return I've got a place to stay and food to eat. When the ranch starts turning profit again, we split it fair. Until then, we just help each other survive." The offer hung in the air between them, so unexpected that Nora couldn't quite process it at first. "You're joking," she finally managed. "You don't even know me. Why would you—" "Because I know what it's like to be alone and desperate," Luke said simply. "And because I'm tired of drifting, Mrs. Whitfield. I've been writing for 3 years now, and I'm bone weary of it. I'd like a place to stop, at least for a season. You need help. I need a purpose. Seems like we could help each other." "I don't need charity," Nora said sharply, her pride rising like a shield. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a partnership." Luke's voice remained calm, reasonable. "You've got land and a house. I've got a strong back and knowledge of ranching. Together, we might just make it through to spring. Apart—" He shrugged. "Apart, we're both probably finished." Nora wanted to refuse, wanted to throw his offer back in his face and tell him she could manage on her own, that she didn't need some drifter cowboy to save her. But Rebecca was watching her with those two knowing eyes, and Thomas's expression was hopeful in a way she hadn't seen in months, and little Emma was already half asleep in her sister's lap, her belly full for the first time in weeks. "1 month," Nora heard herself say. "We try it for 1 month. If it's not working, you ride on. No hard feelings." Luke stood and extended his hand. 1 month. Fair deal, Mrs. Whitfield." Nora stood too and shook his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. "Fair deal, Mr. Barrett." And with that handshake, everything changed. Neither of them knew it yet, how this decision would reshape their lives, how this stranger's arrival would become the hinge on which their futures turned. They only knew that winter was hard, that survival required compromise, and that sometimes the answer to prayer came in unexpected forms. Outside, the Montana wind still howled. But inside the cabin, for the first time in months, there was warmth and food, and something that might have been hope beginning to kindle in the darkness. Luke Barrett was gone before dawn, slipping out into the gray pre-morning light so quietly that Nora didn't hear him leave. She woke to find him already outside, his silhouette dark against the snow as he moved along the fence line with a practiced eye, assessing the damage that winter and neglect had done. From the window, she watched him crouch beside a broken post, running his hands over the splintered wood, then stand and continue his inspection. He moved with the economy of someone who'd spent his life working, no wasted motion, every gesture purposeful. She should have felt relief. He'd kept his word, hadn't tried to take advantage, hadn't done anything but what he'd promised. Instead, she felt a flutter of something uncomfortably close to panic. This stranger was now entangled in her life, in her children's lives, and she knew almost nothing about him except that he was kind, and he was tired, and he was willing to hitch his fate to a dying ranch for reasons she didn't fully understand. "Mama?" Thomas appeared at her elbow, already dressed, his hair sticking up at odd angles. "Is Mr. Barrett still here? I thought maybe I dreamed him." "He's real," Nora said softly, nodding toward the window. "He's checking the fences." Thomas pressed his face to the glass, breath fogging it. "Can I help him?" "You'll have to ask him yourself, but get some breakfast first. There's real oatmeal this morning with a spoonful of that honey." She tried to keep her voice casual, but the words felt strange in her mouth. Real oatmeal, a spoonful of honey, simple things that had become luxuries, now suddenly available again because a stranger had decided to tie his fortune to theirs. The morning unfolded in a way that felt both familiar and entirely foreign. Rebecca cooked the oatmeal under Nora's direction, learning to stir it constantly so it wouldn't scorch, while Emma set the table with a gravity that suggested she understood this meal was important. When Luke came in, stamping snow from his boots, the four of them were already seated, waiting. "Didn't mean to keep you," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Lost track of time out there." "You're fine, Mr. Barrett," Nora said, ladling oatmeal into a fifth bowl she'd set out. "We're just grateful for the company." It was a small lie. She wasn't sure yet what she felt about his company, but it seemed like the polite thing to say. Luke took a seat at the far end of the table, the place David used to occupy, and Nora felt a pang of something that might have been guilt or grief or simply strangeness at seeing someone else in that chair. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of spoons and the snap of the fire. Then Luke cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitfield, I walked your fence line this morning. You've got about 30 posts that need replacing, and twice that many need to be reinforced. Rails are in poor shape too, won't hold cattle worth a damn come spring. Thomas's eyes widened at the casual profanity, but Luke didn't seem to notice. I don't have money for materials, Nora said quietly. David used what we had last summer, and I sold the rest after he died. Don't need to buy anything, Luke said, spreading honey on a piece of bread. You've got timber on the back 40, near the creek. Good straight pines. I can fell what we need, cure it fast over fire, have it ready in a couple weeks. It's not ideal. Greenwood's not as strong, but it'll hold until we can afford better. That's a lot of work, Nora said carefully. For one man. I'll help, Thomas interjected, his voice cracking with eagerness. I'm strong, Mr. Barrett. I can help you fell trees and split rails. Luke regarded the boy with a serious expression. I'm sure you can, Thomas, but felling trees is dangerous work. Tell you what, you can help me with the splitting and the hauling, and I'll teach you how to set posts proper. That's skilled work, and it's something every rancher needs to know. Thomas beamed, sitting up straighter in his chair, and Nora felt her throat tighten. It was such a small thing, this stranger taking her son seriously, treating him like someone capable rather than a burden, but it mattered more than Luke could possibly know. What about the cattle? Rebecca asked suddenly. Papa said we needed at least 50 head to make the ranch work, but we only have 12 left. Most of them died in the cold snap, and Mr. Crow bought the rest from Mama for, she glanced at Nora, for not very much money. Luke's expression darkened slightly at the name Crow, but his voice remained level. 12's not nothing. That's breeding stock if we're smart about it. Come spring, we can try to buy a bull on credit, get those cows bred. By next winter, you'll have calves to sell. It's not fast money, but it's honest money. And if the bank takes the ranch before then? Nora asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. If Mr. Kemp forecloses in 6 weeks like he's threatening? Luke set down his spoon and looked directly at her. Then we make sure he doesn't have reason to. How much do you owe? $240, Nora said flatly. Plus interest. Call it $260 by March. Luke whistled low. That's steep. David borrowed it to buy breeding stock 3 years ago. We were going to pay it off gradually, but then the winter killed half the herd, and the drought took the hay crop, and... She shrugged helplessly. You know how it goes. One thing after another until you're drowning. What if we had something to sell? Luke said thoughtfully. Not cattle, those we keep for breeding, but something else. You've got timber, like I said, good straight pine. There's always demand for lumber in Helena, especially with the mines expanding. If we could get a load down there. How? Nora asked. I don't have a wagon anymore. I sold it. I saw one in your barn. Old, but serviceable. That's got a broken axle. David was going to fix it before... She stopped, the sentence unfinished but complete in its implication. I can fix a broken axle, Luke said simply. Might take me a few days, but I can do it. And if we get that wagon running, we can haul timber. Won't make $200, but it might make 50 or 60. Every bit helps. Nora stared at him, this stranger who was already planning their survival like it was his own, and felt something shift in her chest. Not trust, exactly. It was too soon for that. But maybe the beginning of trust. The tentative sense that perhaps she wasn't alone in this fight anymore. All right, she said quietly. 1 month, like we agreed. We fix fences, repair the wagon, cut timber. We try to save the ranch. Luke nodded once, decisive. 1 month. The days that followed took on a rhythm that felt almost normal. Luke woke before dawn and worked until dark, moving through the ranch's seemingly endless list of problems with methodical efficiency. He fixed the broken axle on the wagon, fabricating a new pin from scrap metal in the barn and heating it red-hot in a makeshift forge he built from river stones. He patched the holes in the barn roof that had been letting in snow, causing the hay to rot. He cleared the ice from the watering trough and reinforced it with fresh planks. He did all of this with minimal conversation, asking Nora's permission for major decisions, but otherwise simply seeing what needed doing and doing it. Thomas shadowed him like a devoted puppy, learning despite Luke's initial protests. Nora watched from the cabin windows as her son learned to swing an axe properly, to measure twice before cutting, to pound fence posts at the correct angle. Luke was patient but exacting, correcting Thomas's mistakes without making him feel stupid, praising his successes without overinflating them. It was good for the boy, Nora realized. He needed a man's guidance, needed someone to show him how to be capable in a world that demanded capability. Rebecca and Emma helped in their own ways. Rebecca took over most of the cooking, following Nora's instructions but adding her own touches. A pinch more salt, an extra handful of dried herbs from the garden Nora had maintained through the summer. The girl had a natural talent for it, and Nora felt a surge of pride watching her daughter stir pots with the same concentrated expression Nora's own mother had worn. Emma, too young for heavy work, became the ranch's runner, carrying water and tools and messages between the various work sites, important in her own small way. And Nora herself worked harder than she had in months, her body remembering what it felt like to have energy again. With food in her belly, real food, regular meals, the dizziness faded and the trembling stopped. She mended clothes, preserved what little food they could spare, kept the cabin clean and warm. She also walked the ranch each afternoon, taking inventory of what they had and what they needed, making lists in her careful handwriting of priorities and possibilities. It was on one of these walks, about a week after Luke's arrival, that she found him at the creek, knee-deep in icy water, wrestling with something heavy beneath the surface. "Mr. Barrett?" she called out, alarmed. "What on earth are you doing?" Luke looked up, his face red with cold and effort. "Beaver Dam," he grunted, heaving at something submerged. "Been backing up the creek, flooding your lower pasture. Need to break it loose." "Get out of that water before you freeze to death," Nora said sharply, surprising herself with the command in her voice. "You'll catch your death." "Almost got it." Luke gave one more mighty heave, and suddenly there was a crack and a rush of water as the dam broke apart. He stumbled backward, nearly falling, then waded to shore where Nora waited with her arms crossed. "There. That's better. Water'll drain now, and come spring that pasture'll be usable again." "You're shaking," Nora observed. Indeed, Luke's whole body was trembling with cold, his lips faintly blue. "Come back to the cabin. I'll heat water for coffee." "I'm fine," Luke insisted, but his teeth were chattering hard enough to make the words almost unintelligible. "You're not fine. You're half frozen. Don't be stubborn." Nora turned and started walking back toward the cabin, not waiting to see if he'd follow. After a moment, she heard the squelch of his wet boots behind her. In the cabin, she stoked the fire high and hung a kettle to boil while Luke stood shivering by the hearth, still protesting weakly that he was all right. Nora ignored him and pulled a blanket from the chest, one of her mother's quilts, precious and warm, and draped it around his shoulders. "Take off those wet boots," she ordered, "and your socks. I'll put them by the fire to dry." Luke obeyed, too cold to argue anymore, and Nora felt a flash of something maternal toward him. This grown man who'd been taking care of her family, but clearly had no one taking care of him. She made strong coffee, added a precious spoonful of sugar, and pressed the cup into his hands. "Drink," she said firmly. "All of it." Luke drank, his shaking gradually subsiding as warmth returned to his body. When he'd finished the coffee, Nora poured him another cup and sat down across from him, studying his face in the firelight. There were lines there she hadn't noticed before, marks of hardship and loss that ran deeper than weather wear. "You don't have to nearly kill yourself for us," she said quietly. "The dam could have waited for warmer weather." "Can't wait for everything," Luke replied, his voice rough from the cold. "Spring will be here before we know it, and if we're not ready—" He shrugged. "Besides, I've worked in colder water than that. I'll be fine." "Where are you from originally, Mr. Barrett?" Nora asked, surprising herself with the personal question. "You've never said." Luke was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Missouri," he finally said. "Little town called Independence. Grew up on a farm, learned ranching from my father. He was a good man, taught me everything I know about cattle and crops and honest work." "Was?" "Died 6 years ago, cholera epidemic. Took him and my mother both within a week." Luke's voice was flat, emotionless, but Nora recognized the tone. It was the same one she used when talking about David. The tone of someone who'd learned to lock grief away because letting it out was too dangerous. "Farm went to my older brother. I stayed on for a while, working for wages, but it wasn't the same, so I left. Been drifting since." 3 years, you said? 3 years of drifting. 3 years before that working for my brother. Luke turned the empty cup in his hands. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed, tried to make it work. But James had his own family, his own ideas about how things should be done. There wasn't room for me there anymore. Nora nodded slowly, understanding dawning. So you've been alone all this time? Alone's not so bad, Luke said, but there was something in his voice that suggested he didn't quite believe it. You go where you want, work when you want, answer to nobody. There's a freedom in that. Freedom and loneliness aren't mutually exclusive, Nora said softly. You can have both. Luke looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared pain, shared solitude. They were both people who'd been abandoned by circumstances, left to navigate an unforgiving world alone. The difference was that Nora had her children to anchor her, while Luke had nothing but the road and whatever temporary place he could find along it. Why did you really stop here? Nora asked. The truth this time, not the story about your horse needing water. Luke smiled faintly. I saw your light, he said, saw it from about 2 miles away, and something made me turn off the road toward it. I told myself I just needed water, needed information about the road north. But the truth is, he paused, searching for words. The truth is I was tired, Mrs. Whitfield. Tired of riding, tired of being alone, tired of waking up in a different place every morning with nobody to care if I lived or died. I saw your light, and for the first time in 3 years I wanted to stop. Really stop, not just pause for a night. So I knocked on your door. And found a widow with 3 hungry children and a failing ranch, Nora said with a bitter laugh. Not much of a stopping place. Found a woman who needed help and wasn't too proud to accept it, Luke corrected gently. Found work that matters, a purpose beyond just surviving another day. That's more than I've had in a long time, Mrs. Whitfield. So maybe I'm the lucky one here. Nora felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked away, uncomfortable with the intimacy of the conversation. This was dangerous territory, getting to know this man, understanding his motivations, seeing him as a person rather than just a pair of capable hands. It created connections, obligations, the possibility of hurt. But before she could change the subject, the cabin door burst open and Thomas tumbled in, followed more sedately by Rebecca with Emma in tow. Mama, I split 20 rails today, Thomas announced proudly. Mr. Barrett said they were good enough for the fence and everything. That's wonderful, Thomas, Nora said, grateful for the interruption. Why don't you wash up for supper? Rebecca, did you check the beans like I asked? The moment of intimacy shattered, replaced by the familiar bustle of family life. Luke retreated to his corner, boots now dry and replaced on his feet, while the children chattered about their day's adventures. But throughout the evening, Nora found herself acutely aware of his presence. The way he listened to Thomas's excited rambling with genuine interest. The way he praised Rebecca's cooking without condescension. The way he let Emma climb onto his lap to show him her doll without complaint. He fit, she realized with some alarm. This stranger who'd been here barely a week fit into their lives like he'd always belonged, filling a gap she hadn't even fully acknowledged existed. And that was dangerous, because in 3 more weeks their agreement would be up, and Luke Barrett would ride away to Fort Benton or wherever the road took him next, leaving them alone again. Unless. The thought came unbidden, and Nora pushed it away firmly. She couldn't afford to think that way, couldn't afford to hope that this arrangement might become permanent. Luke had been clear, he was tired of drifting, but that didn't mean he wanted to settle. Didn't mean he wanted the responsibility of someone else's family, someone else's problems. He was helping them because he was a decent man, and when the month was up, he'd leave because that was what drifters did. They left. Still, as the days passed and January surrendered to February, Nora found it increasingly difficult to imagine the ranch without Luke Barrett in it. He was everywhere, fixing, building, improving. The fence line slowly took shape, new posts replacing rotten ones, rails straight and strong. The wagon, once broken and useless, now sat ready in the barn, waiting for its load of timber. Even the cattle seemed healthier, benefiting from Luke's attention to their shelter and feed. But it was the small things that affected Nora most. The way Luke made sure there was always firewood stacked by the door so she wouldn't have to carry it in the cold. The way he'd repaired the rocking chair that had lost a rung, Not because she'd asked, but because he'd noticed she avoided sitting in it. The way he taught Thomas not just to work, but to think about work, to problem solve and adapt. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, with something that might have been longing or might have been just the basic human need for connection. She couldn't quite read his eyes, and she was afraid to try. It was the second week of February when Silas Crow came calling. Nora saw his fancy buggy coming up the drive and felt her stomach clench with dread. Crow was the wealthiest rancher in the territory, a man who'd made his fortune buying up struggling homesteads for pennies on the dollar and building them into his sprawling empire. He'd been circling her property since before David died, making increasingly insulting offers, and she knew he was just waiting for the bank to foreclose so he could swoop in and claim it all. "Mr. Crow," she said coldly as he climbed down from his buggy, his expensive coat and polished boots a stark contrast to her worn dress and mud-caked hem. "What brings you out here?" Crow smiled, showing too many teeth. He was a handsome man in his 50s, well-fed and prosperous, with silver at his temples and the confidence of someone who'd never known real hardship. "Mrs. Whitfield, I was passing by and thought I'd stop in, see how you were managing through this difficult winter." "I'm managing fine," Nora said, crossing her arms. She didn't invite him inside. "I can see that," Crow said, his eyes roaming over the property, taking in the new fence posts, the repaired barn roof, the general air of improvement. "You've been busy. Or should I say, someone's been busy on your behalf." He'd noticed Luke then. Nora followed his gaze and saw Luke standing by the barn, an axe in one hand, watching them with an expression that was carefully neutral. "I've hired help," Nora said shortly, "for the ranch work." "Hired help?" Crow's smile widened. "With what money, I wonder?" "Last I heard, you were selling your last possessions just to keep food on the table, but perhaps you found another form of payment for your hired hand." The insinuation was clear and deliberate, designed to wound and humiliate. Nora felt rage rise hot in her throat, but before she could respond, Luke was there, moving with that deceptive quiet of his, placing himself between Nora and Crow. "You got something to say, mister. You say it plain," Luke said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "None of this dancing around with ugly implications." Crow's smile faltered slightly. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Silas Crow, owner of the Double C Ranch, the largest spread in 3 counties. Luke Barrett. I'm helping Mrs. Whitfield get her ranch back on its feet." Luke didn't offer his hand, and after a moment, Crow lowered his own. "Was there something you needed, Mr. Crow? Because if not, we've got work to do." "I came to make Mrs. Whitfield an offer," Crow said, recovering his composure. "A generous offer, given her circumstances. $150 for the property. Immediate payment. She can use it to relocate somewhere more suitable for a woman alone with children." "That's half what it's worth," Luke said flatly before Nora could respond. "Less than half. And you know it." "It's more than the bank will give her when they foreclose," Crow countered. "Which they will, in about 4 weeks. At least this way she gets something." "The ranch isn't for sale," Nora said, finding her voice. "Not to you, not to anyone. I'm going to make the payment to the bank, and I'm going to keep my home." Crow laughed, genuinely amused. "With what, Mrs. Whitfield? You can fix all the fences you want, but it won't change the fact that you owe the bank $260 you don't have. Be reasonable. Take my offer. It's more than generous under the circumstances." "I said no." "You're being foolish," Crow said, his amusement fading. "Stubborn and foolish. But suit yourself. When the bank takes it, I'll buy it from them for even less, and you'll end up with nothing. At least think of your children." "My children are none of your concern," Nora said coldly. "Now get off my property, Mr. Crow. You're not welcome here." For a moment, Crow's mask of civility slipped, and Nora saw the calculation underneath, the predatory patience of a man who'd built his fortune on other people's misery. Then the smile returned, tight and cold. "Very well, Mrs. Whitfield. I hope your pride keeps you warm when you're homeless." He climbed back into his buggy and snapped the reins, sending his horse trotting back down the drive. Nora watched him go, her body trembling with rage and humiliation and fear. Luke stood beside her, solid and steady, not saying anything but simply present. When Crow's buggy disappeared from view, Nora finally let herself breathe. "He'll get the ranch anyway," she said flatly. "When the bank forecloses. He's right about that." "Maybe," Luke said, "but maybe not. We've still got 4 weeks." 4 weeks isn't enough time to earn $260, Mr. Barrett. Be realistic. "I am being realistic," Luke replied. "We've got timber to sell, remember? And I've been thinking, your cattle, the 12 you have left. They're all cows, aren't they? No bull?" "David sold the bull last year when we needed money." "Why?" "Because I know a man in Helena who raises breeding bulls. Good stock, proven bloodlines. He might be willing to loan us one for the season if we promise him pick of the calves in return." "That won't help with the bank payment," Nora pointed out. "No, but it'll help with next year's income. And if we can show the bank we've got a solid plan for making money, timber sales, spring calves, improved property, they might be willing to extend the note." "Banks don't want to foreclose, Mrs. Whitfield. Foreclosure costs them money. They'd rather have a paying customer than a property they have to sell at auction." Nora looked at him, this man who refused to give up even when the odds were stacked impossibly high. "You really think we can do this? Really think we can save the ranch?" Luke was quiet for a moment, and Nora appreciated that he didn't give her false hope, didn't make promises he couldn't keep. "I think we can try," he finally said. "I think we can work as hard as we know how and see what happens. That's all anyone can do, Mrs. Whitfield. Try, and then see." It wasn't much of a comfort, but it was honest, and Nora found herself nodding. "All right," she said. "We try." That evening, after the children were asleep, Nora sat at the table making lists by lamplight. Lists of what they needed to do, what they needed to earn, how they might possibly cobble together enough money to satisfy the bank. Luke sat across from her, whittling something from a piece of scrap pine, the knife moving in his hands with easy confidence. "You never did tell me what made you agree to this," Nora said suddenly, not looking up from her lists. 1 month, working for no wages on a failing ranch. Most men would have kept writing. Luke was quiet for so long that Nora thought he might not answer. Then he said, "You fed me." Nora looked up, confused. "What?" "That first night, you had barely enough food for your children, but you made a meal and shared it with a stranger. You didn't have to do that. You could have taken my supplies and sent me on my way. But you didn't." He looked at her directly, his gray eyes serious in the lamplight. "That meant something, Mrs. Whitfield. It meant you were someone worth helping. Someone who understood that we're all just trying to survive, and that maybe the way we survive is by helping each other." "That's a lot to read into a bowl of stew," Nora said, her voice unsteady. "Maybe. But I've been a lot of places and met a lot of people, and I've learned to recognize kindness when I see it. Real kindness, not the performative kind. You were kind when you had no reason to be, when you got nothing from it." Luke turned back to his whittling. "That's the kind of person I want to help. That's the kind of place I want to be." Nora felt tears prick her eyes and looked back down at her lists, blinking hard. "Well," she managed after a moment, "I'm glad you stopped." "So am I, Mrs. Whitfield," Luke said softly. "So am I." Outside, the February wind howled, but inside the cabin, the fire burned steady and warm. And for the first time since David's death, Nora let herself believe, just a little, that maybe they would survive this after all. The timber cutting began in earnest the following week, when the worst of February's bite had gentled into something almost bearable. Luke and Thomas set out each morning into the pine forest on the back 40, their breath misting in the cold air, axes slung over their shoulders. Nora watched them go with a mixture of pride and worry. Pride because Thomas walked taller these days, his shoulders squared with purpose, and worry because timber work was dangerous, and she'd already lost 1 man to this unforgiving land. But Luke was careful. She'd grant him that. He taught Thomas to read the trees before cutting, to judge the lean and the wind, to plan the fall so nothing unpredictable happened. He taught him to yell timber and stand clear to watch for widowmakers, those hanging branches that could break loose and kill a man in an instant. And he never let the boy work beyond his strength, calling breaks when Thomas's young arms started to shake, sharing water and the hard bread Rebecca had packed for them. They worked like that for 10 days straight, felling pines that Luke had marked the week before, trimming branches, cutting the trunks into manageable lengths. The sound of axes echoed across the ranch from dawn until dusk, a steady rhythm that became the soundtrack of their days. Rebecca and Nora took turns bringing them lunch at midday, walking through the snow with baskets of food, finding them always working. Luke's shirt damp with sweat despite the cold, Thomas's face red with exertion and pride. "How many more do you need?" Nora asked one afternoon, watching Luke notch another trunk with practiced efficiency. "Another 3, maybe 4, Luke replied, pausing to wipe his brow. "Want to have enough for a full wagon load. More timber means better price in Helena." "When will you leave?" The question came out more anxiously than Nora intended, and she saw Luke's eyes flicker to her face. "Day after tomorrow, if the weather holds. It's a 2-day journey to Helena, 2 days back. I'll be gone maybe 5 or 6 days total." He went back to his axing, but added casually, "Thomas is welcome to come with me if you're agreeable. Boy's earned it, and it'd be good for him to see how timber's sold, learn the business side of ranching." Nora's first instinct was to refuse. 5 or 6 days without her son felt impossibly long, especially when she'd already lost so much. But she looked at Thomas, who'd stopped his own work to stare at Luke with naked hope, and knew she couldn't deny him this. The boy needed this, needed to feel capable and trusted, and like he was contributing something real to their survival. "All right," she said quietly, "but you take care of him, Mr. Barrett. If anything happens—" "Nothing will happen," Luke interrupted gently. "You have my word on that, Mrs. Whitfield." That evening, Nora pulled Thomas aside while Luke was tending to his horse. "You listen to Mr. Barrett while you're gone," she said, gripping her son's shoulders. "You do exactly what he says. You hear me? And you stay close to him in Helena. It's a rough town, and I don't want you getting into any trouble." "I will, Mama," Thomas promised, his eyes shining with excitement. "I'll be careful, I promise. And I'll help Mr. Barrett get the best price for our timber. Just wait and see." "I know you will, sweetheart." Nora pulled him into a hug, breathing in the scent of him, wood smoke and pine sap, and the particular smell that was just Thomas. "I'm proud of you. Your father would be proud too." She felt the boy stiffen slightly at the mention of David, then relax into her embrace. They stood like that for a long moment, mother and son, before Thomas pulled away and went to help Luke load the wagon for the next day's departure. They left at first light, the wagon piled high with cut timber, Luke's horse tied to the back, and Thomas sitting proudly on the bench seat beside him. Nora stood in the doorway with Rebecca and Emma, watching until the wagon disappeared over the rise, feeling like part of her heart was riding away with them. Rebecca slipped a hand into hers and squeezed. "They'll be fine, Mama," the girl said with a confidence Nora wished she felt. "Mr. Barrett won't let anything happen to Thomas." "I know," Nora said, though knowing and believing were two different things. "Come on, let's get to work. Those fences won't mend themselves." The ranch felt emptier without Luke and Thomas, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Nora found herself listening for the ring of axes, for Luke's low voice instructing Thomas, for the easy back and forth that had become familiar. Instead, there was only wind and the occasional lowing of cattle and the small domestic sounds she and the girls made as they went about their work. But there was also a strange kind of peace in it. For the first time in weeks, Nora had time to think, to process everything that had changed since Luke Barrett knocked on her door that frozen February night. She thought about how quickly she'd come to depend on him, how seamlessly he'd woven himself into their lives. And she thought about what would happen when their month was up, less than 2 weeks now, and whether he'd actually leave as planned, or whether there might be some way to convince him to stay. That thought troubled her more than she wanted to admit. She'd been so certain she didn't need anyone, that she could manage on her own if she just worked hard enough and sacrificed enough. But Luke had shown her the lie in that. Some burdens were simply too heavy for one person to carry. Some problems too big for pure determination to solve. She needed help. The question was whether accepting that help meant becoming dependent on a man who might disappear as suddenly as he'd appeared. On the second night of their absence, Nora was mending by lamplight when Rebecca spoke up from her corner where she was teaching Emma her letters. "Mama, is Mr. Barrett going to stay?" The question was so direct, so perfectly aligned with Nora's own thoughts, that she nearly dropped her needle. "What makes you ask that, Becca?" "Because our month's almost up," Rebecca said matter-of-factly. "That was the deal you made with him. 1 month. But he's done so much work, and Thomas says the ranch is starting to look good again. and I just wondered if maybe he'd want to stay longer. I don't know, sweetheart, Nora said honestly. Mr. Barrett's a drifter. He goes where the work is. When our month is up, he'll probably move on to Fort Benton like he planned. But what if he doesn't want to move on? Emma piped up, her small voice serious. What if he likes it here with us? Then that would be wonderful, Nora said carefully. But we can't assume what other people want, girls. Mr. Barrett has his own life, his own plans. We're grateful for his help, but we can't expect him to give up his freedom for us. Don't you want him to stay? Rebecca pressed, her dark eyes too knowing as always. I see how you look at him sometimes, Mama, like you did at Papa. Nora felt heat flood her face. That's not... I don't... She stopped, gathering herself. Mr. Barrett is a good man who's been kind to us. That's all. And it's inappropriate to suggest otherwise, Rebecca. Do you understand? Rebecca nodded, but her expression suggested she understood far more than Nora was admitting. The girl was too perceptive for her own good, seeing things that Nora herself was trying desperately not to acknowledge. Like the way her heart lifted when Luke came in from work each evening, or the way she found herself listening for his voice, seeking his opinion, depending on his strength in ways that went beyond the merely practical. It was dangerous, this growing attachment. David had been dead less than 4 months. It was too soon to feel anything for another man, too soon to even think about it. And yet here she was, lying awake at night wondering if Luke Barrett might be more than just hired help, might be something that resembled hope for a future she'd thought was closed to her forever. The third day without them dragged interminably. Nora threw herself into work, mending, cleaning, organizing, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind occupied. But by evening, she was pacing the cabin like a caged animal, going to the window every few minutes to peer out at the empty road, anxiety gnawing at her stomach. They're not due back until tomorrow, Rebecca reminded her gently. Probably late tomorrow, if the selling took time. I know, Nora said, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. I know that. She trailed off, unable to articulate the nameless dread that had taken hold of her. What if something had happened? What if there had been an accident, or trouble in Helena, or a dozen other disasters her mind conjured with cruel clarity? What if she'd sent her son away and he wasn't coming back? Mama, come away from the window, Rebecca said firmly, sounding disturbingly like an adult. Come help me with supper. You'll feel better once you eat something. Nora let herself be led away, let her daughter take charge with the same quiet competence that David had once shown. When had Rebecca grown up so much? When had this child become someone she could lean on, someone who noticed when Nora was falling apart and knew how to pull her back from the edge? They ate in near silence, then went to bed early, all three of them crowded together in the main bed for warmth and comfort. Emma fell asleep immediately, her small body curled against Nora's side. Rebecca took longer, but eventually her breathing deepened and steadied. Only Nora lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind and praying wordlessly for Thomas's safety, for Luke's safe return, for morning to come quickly. She must have dozed eventually because she woke to the sound of wagon wheels on frozen ground and the jingle of harness. Gray dawn light filtered through the windows, and Nora was out of bed and at the door before she'd fully registered what she was hearing. She threw it open to see the wagon rolling up to the house, Luke on the bench and Thomas beside him, both of them grinning like they'd conquered the world. Mama! Thomas called out, jumping down before the wagon had fully stopped. Mama, we did it! We sold all the timber, and you won't believe how much we got for it. Nora grabbed her son and held him tight, not caring that he was too old for such displays, not caring that Luke was watching from the wagon seat with an expression she couldn't quite read. Thomas was home. Thomas was safe. Nothing else mattered. Let me breathe, Mama, Thomas protested, but he was laughing, hugging her back just as fiercely. I'm fine, I promise. The trip was amazing. Helena's so big, Mama, you wouldn't believe it. Buildings 3 stories tall and so many people, and the lumberyard. Slow down, Nora said, finally releasing him. Come inside, both of you. You must be frozen and starving. Luke climbed down from the wagon, moving stiffly like the long drive had settled into his bones. His face was windburned and exhausted, but there was something triumphant in his eyes that made Nora's breath catch. How much? She asked quietly as Thomas ran ahead into the cabin, already chattering to his sisters. "How much did you get for the timber?" Luke reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with coins. $73, he said, pressing it into her hands. The lumberyard manager said it was the finest pine he'd seen in months. Gave us top price for the whole load. $73. It was more than Nora had dared hope for, more than seemed possible. With what she'd saved from selling David's belongings and what little she had left from the last cattle sale, it brought them to nearly $120. Still short of what they needed for the bank, but not impossibly so. Not anymore. "Mr. Barrett?" she started, her voice thick with emotion, but Luke shook his head. "Credit goes to Thomas. Boy haggled like he was born to it. Got us an extra $5 by pointing out how straight the grain was. I was ready to take the first offer." He smiled, genuine warmth in his expression. "You've got a sharp son there, Mrs. Whitfield. He'll make a fine rancher someday." Nora felt tears threaten and blinked them back hard. "Thank you," she managed, "for taking him, for teaching him, for all of it." Luke just nodded and moved past her into the cabin, where Thomas was regaling his sisters with tales of Helena's wonders. Nora followed more slowly, the pouch heavy in her hands, feeling the weight of $73 and what it represented. Not just money, but possibility. The ranch wasn't saved yet, but for the first time, salvation felt like something that might actually be within reach. They celebrated that night with a feast by their standards. Venison stew that Luke had traded for in Helena, fresh bread Rebecca had baked that morning, and even a small bag of peppermint sticks that Luke had brought back for the children. Emma's eyes went wide as saucers when she saw them, and even serious Rebecca couldn't suppress a smile. "You didn't have to do that," Nora said quietly as the children sucked happily on their treats. "I wanted to," Luke replied simply. "They've worked hard. They deserved something special." Over supper, Thomas talked nonstop about Helena, the buildings, the people, the energy of a mining town in its prime. He talked about the lumberyard and the assayer's office, and the grand hotel where he'd seen women in dresses finer than anything they had back home. Luke let him talk, interjecting occasionally with his own observations, but mostly just watching the boy with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "And there was this one man," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a more serious register. "Big fellow with a scar on his face. He came up while we were loading the wagon at the lumberyard and started asking Mr. Barrett questions. Personal questions like where he was from and where he was headed. Made me nervous, but Mr. Barrett handled it real smooth." "What kind of questions?" Nora asked, a thread of worry winding through her contentment. Luke waved it off. "Just a drifter, probably looking for work or a handout. Nothing to concern yourself with." But Thomas wasn't finished. "He asked if you were planning to stay in the territory, Mr. Barrett. Asked if you had family around here. And when you said no, he got this strange look on his face, like he knew something we didn't." "Thomas," Luke said, his voice carrying a note of warning. "Drop it." "But Mama should know. I said drop it." Luke's tone was firm enough that Thomas fell silent, though his expression was mutinous. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table, broken only by Emma's contented humming as she finished her peppermint stick. Nora studied Luke's face, seeing tension there that hadn't been present before. "Mr. Barrett, if there's something I should know—" "There's nothing," Luke said flatly. "Just a nosy stranger in a town full of nosy strangers. Nothing to worry about." But Nora did worry, all through the cleanup and the settling of children into bed, and the quiet hour afterward when she and Luke sat by the fire, as had become their custom. Something had happened in Helena, something that Thomas had seen and Luke didn't want discussed. And while Luke's secrets were his own business, Nora couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this was, it might matter. "The man in Helena," she finally said, breaking the silence. "Who was he really?" Luke was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Nobody. Just someone from my past, probably. Or someone who knew someone I used to know. The territory's not as big as it seems, Mrs. Whitfield. People cross paths. And this crossing of paths, is it going to cause problems?" "No," Luke said firmly. "It won't. I made sure of it." Nora wanted to press, wanted to demand the truth, but she recognized the set of Luke's jaw, the way he'd closed himself off. Whatever the full story was, he wasn't going to share it tonight. Maybe not ever. "All right," she said finally. "I'll trust you on this, Mr. Barrett. But if there's trouble coming—" "There isn't," Luke interrupted. "I promise you, Mrs. Whitfield, nothing from my past is going to touch you or your children. You have my word on that." It should have been reassuring, but something in the way he said it, the particular emphasis on "my past," sent a chill down Nora's spine. What kind of past did Luke Barrett have that made strangers with scarred faces ask questions in lumber yards? What was he running from when he showed up on her doorstep that frozen February night? But before she could ask any of these questions, there was a sharp knock at the door, loud and authoritative, the kind of knock that meant official business or trouble. And at this time of night, there was rarely a difference between the two. Luke was on his feet instantly, his hand dropping to where Nora knew he kept a knife sheathed at his belt. "Stay here," he said quietly, moving toward the door with the careful grace of someone who'd been in dangerous situations before. "Mr. Barrett, stay here, Mrs. Whitfield." He positioned himself to one side of the door and called out, "Who's there?" "Marshal Dixon, Helena Territory Office." The voice was clipped, professional. "I'm looking for a man called Luke Barrett. I'm told he might be here." Nora's blood ran cold. A marshal, looking for Luke specifically, and somehow knowing to find him here, at her ranch, when he'd only been back a few hours. The man from Helena, she thought with sudden clarity. The scarred stranger hadn't been just curious. He'd been tracking Luke, and now he'd sent the law after him. Luke's face had gone carefully blank, revealing nothing. He opened the door slowly, keeping his body positioned between the marshal and the interior of the cabin where Nora stood frozen. "I'm Luke Barrett," he said evenly. "What can I do for you, Marshal?" Marshal Dixon was a tall man in his 40s, wearing a heavy coat and a badge that gleamed dully in the lamplight. His eyes were sharp and assessing as they studied Luke, then flicked past him to where Nora stood. "Mind if I come in? It's cold out here, and what I have to say might take a minute." "That depends," Luke said, not moving from the doorway. "What's this about?" "About a man named William Barrett," the marshal said, watching Luke's face carefully. "Brothers, I'm guessing, given the family resemblance. He's wanted for robbery in 3 counties, and word is you might know where to find him." Nora saw Luke's shoulders relax fractionally. Whatever he'd been expecting, this apparently wasn't it. "I haven't seen my brother in 3 years, Marshal, not since I left Missouri, and if he's gotten himself mixed up in something criminal, that's got nothing to do with me." "Maybe," Dixon said. "Or maybe you're hiding him. Maybe that's why you're out here in the middle of nowhere, playing ranch hand on a widow's property. Good cover for a wanted man's brother." "I'm not hiding anyone," Luke said, his voice hardening. "And Mrs. Whitfield has nothing to do with any of this. She hired me as legitimate help, nothing more." "That true, ma'am?" Dixon's eyes found Nora's. "This man just drifted in looking for work? Or did you know him before?" Nora stepped forward, drawing herself up to her full height. "Mr. Barrett came to my door 6 weeks ago asking for water, Marshal. I'd never seen him before in my life. He offered to help with the ranch in exchange for room and board, and I accepted because I'm a widow with 3 children and I need the help. That's the full extent of our relationship, and I'll thank you not to imply otherwise." Dixon studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. I'll take you at your word, Mrs. Whitfield, but I need to search the property, just to be sure." "Search away," Nora said coldly. "You won't find anything because there's nothing to find. But I'll ask you to be quiet about it. My children are sleeping, and I won't have them frightened." The marshal's search was thorough but quick, checking the barn and the outbuildings before returning to the cabin to verify that it was indeed just Nora, her 3 children, and Luke in residence. When he was satisfied, he tipped his hat to Nora with something that might have been apology in his expression. "Sorry for the intrusion, ma'am, but when someone reports seeing Luke Barrett and Helena, I have to follow up. His brothers caused a lot of trouble for a lot of people." "My brother's troubles are his own," Luke said quietly. "And if I see him, I'll be sure to let you know, Marshal. But I haven't, and I doubt I will. We weren't close, even before he turned outlaw." Dixon nodded and turned to leave, but paused at the door. "One more thing, Barrett. There's a man asking questions about you and Helena. Big fellow with a scar. Claims he knew you in Missouri. Says you owe him money." Luke's expression didn't change, but Nora saw his hands flex slightly at his sides. I don't owe anybody anything, Marshall. If someone's claiming otherwise, they're lying. Maybe. But he seemed pretty convinced, and he had friends with him, the kind of friends who don't ask polite questions. Dixon's eyes were sympathetic now. Just thought you should know. These kinds of situations have a way of escalating. Appreciated, Luke said shortly. Good night, Marshall. When the door closed behind Dixon, Luke stood there for a long moment, his back to Nora, shoulders rigid with tension. Outside, they could hear the marshal's horse clopping away into the darkness. Inside, the silence stretched thin and dangerous. Well, Nora finally said, her voice sharp with anger and fear, I suppose now you're going to tell me the truth about who you really are and what kind of trouble you've brought to my doorstep. Luke turned slowly, and the expression on his face was something Nora had never seen before, raw and wounded and exhausted all at once. I told you the truth, Mrs. Whitfield. My name is Luke Barrett. I'm from Missouri, and I've been drifting for 3 years. Everything I said was true. Except the part about your brother being an outlaw. Except the part about men with scars looking for you. Except all the parts you conveniently left out. Nora crossed her arms, holding herself together through sheer force of will. You said nothing from your past would touch me or my children, Mr. Barrett. You promised, and not 4 hours later a marshal shows up at my door asking questions. I know, Luke said quietly, and I'm sorry. I thought I'd left all that behind. I thought... He stopped, rubbed his face with both hands. My brother William, he got mixed up with some bad people back in Missouri. Gambling debts, then robbery to pay off the debts, then more debts and more robbery. I tried to help him, tried to pull him out of it, but he wouldn't listen. So I left. Figured putting distance between us was the only way to stay clear of his mess. But the distance wasn't enough, Nora said. Apparently not. Luke's voice was bitter. The man in Helena, the one with the scar, his name is Caleb Stone. He's one of the men William owes money to, and he thinks I might know where William is. Or he thinks I have money to pay William's debts. Either way, he's wrong on both counts. And if he comes here? If he decides to make trouble for you, trouble that spills over onto me and my children? He won't, Luke said firmly. I made it clear in Helena that I don't have what he's looking for, that I can't help him find William. He has no reason to come here. The marshal found us, Nora pointed out. If he could track you here, so can this Caleb Stone. Luke was silent, and that silence was answer enough. Nora felt something crack inside her chest. Not quite breaking, but fracturing, letting cold seep in. You should go, she said quietly. In the morning, take whatever wages you think you've earned from that timber money and ride on to Fort Benton like you planned. It's better that way. Safer for everyone. Mrs. Whitfield, we had an agreement, Mr. Barrett. 1 month. And that month is nearly up anyway. I'm just suggesting we end it a few days early before your past catches up to us in a way we can't manage. And what about the ranch? What about the bank payment? You've got $73, but you need at least $260. How will you... I'll figure it out, Nora interrupted, though she had no idea how. I always do. We survived before you came, and we'll survive after you leave. Luke looked at her for a long moment, and Nora saw pain in his eyes, real pain that made her want to take back her words. But she couldn't. She'd let herself depend on him, let herself start to hope, and look where it had gotten her. Marshals at her door, strangers with scars asking questions, the shadow of someone else's criminal past falling across her children's home. If that's what you want, Luke finally said, I'll leave at first light. It's what I want, Nora lied and turned away before he could see the tears starting to blur her vision. Good night, Mr. Barrett. She went to bed without another word, lying down beside her sleeping daughters and staring into the darkness. In his corner, she could hear Luke moving quietly, probably packing his few belongings, preparing for tomorrow's departure. And with every small sound, Nora felt the fragile hope she'd been building crack a little more, until by dawn, it would surely shatter completely, leaving her right back where she'd started, alone, desperate, and running out of time. But dawn came, and Luke Barrett was still there, standing at the corral in the gray light, his horse saddled and ready, but going nowhere. Nora saw him from the kitchen window as she started the morning fire, saw the set of his shoulders and the way he kept looking back at the cabin like he was trying to memorize it. Her hands trembled as she measured out coffee. Real coffee. Another luxury they had because of him. And she had to stop and press her palms flat against the table to steady herself. She'd lain awake most of the night, wrestling with her decision, trying to convince herself it was the right one. Send him away. Protect her children. Return to the struggle she'd known before, hard but familiar, without the complications Luke brought with him. It was logical. It was safe. It was the choice any reasonable woman would make. So why did it feel like she was tearing out her own heart? Thomas emerged from his corner, already dressed, and went straight to the window. "Mr. Barrett's still here," he said, relief clear in his voice. "I thought maybe he'd already gone." "He's leaving this morning," Nora said, keeping her voice flat. "I asked him to go." Thomas spun around, his face stricken. "What? Why?" "Mama, he just got back from Helena, and we made good money on the timber, and there's still so much work to do before spring." "Thomas, that's enough." Nora couldn't look at her son, couldn't bear to see the betrayal in his eyes. "It's complicated. Mr. Barrett has his own life to live, and we can't keep depending on him." "But we need him," Thomas said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Mama, you know we do. The fences aren't all fixed yet, and the wagon still needs work, and I was going to help him clear the lower pasture next week." "I said that's enough." Nora's voice came out sharper than she intended, and Thomas flinched. "Mr. Barrett is leaving, and that's final. Now go wake your sisters and get washed for breakfast." Thomas stood there for a moment longer, his jaw working like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to demand explanations she wasn't ready to give. Then he turned and stalked away, his young body rigid with anger and confusion. Nora heard him talking in low, urgent tones to Rebecca, heard Rebecca's shocked response, and closed her eyes against the knowledge that she was hurting all of them with this decision. But what choice did she have? Marshals and outlaws and men with scars. That wasn't the life she wanted for her children. Better to struggle honestly than to be caught up in someone else's dangerous past. The door opened and Luke came in, bringing cold air with him. He removed his hat and stood there awkwardly, looking around the cabin like he was cataloging everything one last time. His saddlebags were packed and slung over one shoulder, and in his hand he held a small carved wooden horse that Nora recognized as the thing he'd been whittling a few nights ago. "Made this for Emma," he said quietly, setting it on the table. "Thought she might like it for her doll to ride." Nora picked up the horse, feeling the smooth wood, the careful detail in the mane and tail. It was beautiful, clearly the work of hours, and she had to blink hard against the sudden burning in her eyes. "She'll love it," she managed. "Thank you." Luke nodded and pulled a worn leather pouch from his coat, setting it beside the horse with a heavy clink. "That's half the timber money, your share. I took payment for the work I did, seemed only fair, but the rest is yours." "Mr. Barrett, I can't." "It's yours," Luke said firmly. "We were partners in that timber sale, remember? You provided the trees and the wagon, I provided the labor. Split it even. That's how partnerships work." He paused, then added more quietly, "Should be enough, with what you've already saved, to make the bank payment. Maybe have a little left over for seed and supplies." Nora looked at the pouch, feeling the weight of it, the weight of everything it represented. He'd left her enough to save the ranch, even as she was sending him away. The generosity of it, the sheer decency, made her want to weep. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "Yes, I did." Luke's gray eyes met hers steadily. "I told you I'd help you save this ranch, Mrs. Whitfield. I meant it. The fact that I'm leaving doesn't change that promise." "Luke," his given name slipped out before she could stop it, and she saw something flicker in his expression. "I'm sorry about last night, about sending you away. It's not because of anything you did wrong. It's just, you're protecting your children," Luke finished. "I know. And you're right to. They've been through enough without getting dragged into my family's mess." He picked up his hat, turned it in his hands. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Whitfield, these past weeks have been the best I've had in 3 years. First time I felt like I belonged somewhere, like I was doing something that mattered. So thank you for that. For giving me a place to stop, even if it was just temporary." He settled his hat on his head and moved toward the door, and Nora felt panic rise in her throat. This was wrong. This was all wrong. She was letting fear make her decisions, letting other people's problems determine her life. And in doing so, she was throwing away something precious, something she might never find again. "Wait," she heard herself say. "Just wait a moment." Luke paused, his hand on the door latch, looking back at her with an expression of careful neutrality that didn't quite hide the hope underneath. "If you stayed," Nora said slowly, working through the thoughts even as she spoke them, "if you stayed and this Caleb Stone came looking for you, what would happen?" "I'd deal with it," Luke said simply. "I'd make sure it didn't touch you or your family, whatever it took." "That's not an answer, Mr. Barrett. That's a promise you might not be able to keep." Luke was quiet for a long moment. Then he set down his saddlebags and came back to the table, sitting across from her with his hands folded. "Caleb Stone is a bully and a thug, but he's not stupid. He knows I don't have his money and I don't know where William is. Coming out here would be a waste of his time, and men like Stone don't waste time on dead ends. The most likely scenario is that he'll keep looking for William, and when he finds him, if he finds him, he'll get whatever satisfaction he's after without ever thinking about me again." "And the least likely scenario?" "The least likely scenario is that he decides to make an example of me. Comes here, causes trouble, tries to force me to pay William's debts, or lead him to my brother." Luke's voice was steady, matter of fact. "If that happens, I'll handle it. I'm not without resources, Mrs. Whitfield. I can take care of myself, and I can take care of the people I care about." The people I care about. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that Nora was afraid to examine too closely. "What kind of resources?" she asked instead. Luke smiled faintly. "I'm good with my fists and better with a gun. I know how to read men, know when trouble's coming and how to avoid it. And if avoiding it isn't possible, I know how to end it quick and final." He must have seen something in her face because he added, "I'm not a violent man by nature, Mrs. Whitfield, but I spent 3 years drifting through rough country, and you don't survive that by being soft. When necessary, I can be very hard indeed." Nora should have been frightened by this admission, by the implication that Luke Barrett had violence in his past, had perhaps done things that would shock her if she knew the details. Instead, she felt oddly reassured. The world was a dangerous place, especially for women and children alone on isolated ranches. Having someone capable of meeting that danger on its own terms wasn't a liability, it was survival. "The children need you," she said quietly. "Thomas especially. He's never had a man take him seriously before, never had someone teach him the way you have. And Rebecca and Emma, they've started to bloom again, started to laugh and play like children should, because they feel safe. Because you made them feel safe. And you, Mrs. Whitfield," Luke's voice was gentle. "What do you need?" The question caught her off guard, so direct and personal that she didn't have a prepared answer. What did she need? She'd been so focused on her children's needs, on the ranch's needs, on simply surviving day to day that she'd forgotten she was allowed to have needs of her own. "I need help," she finally said, the admission coming hard. "I need someone I can depend on, someone who'll stay when things get difficult instead of leaving. I need," she faltered, then pushed forward. "I need to not be alone anymore. Not just for the practical things, though heaven knows those matter, but for the other things. The conversation at the end of the day. The feeling that someone's standing beside you instead of watching you struggle. She stopped, realizing she was saying too much, revealing too much. But Luke was looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, and she knew he understood everything she wasn't saying. "I'll stay," he said simply. "If you'll have me, Mrs. Whitfield, I'll stay. Not for a month or a season, but for as long as you need me. As long as you want me here." "Your drifting days," Nora said. "You'd give those up?" "I was never drifting towards something," Luke said. "I was drifting away from something, from my brother's mess, from memories I didn't want to face, from the feeling that I'd failed everyone who ever mattered to me. But that's not living, Mrs. Whitfield. That's just existing. And I'm tired of existing. I want to live again. I want to build something that lasts. I want—" He stopped, seeming to wrestle with himself, then continued in a rush. "I want to be the kind of man your children can depend on, the kind of man you can depend on. I want to matter again." "You already matter, Mr. Barrett," Nora said softly. "You've mattered since the moment you knocked on my door and gave us hope when we had none left." Before either of them could say more, the bedroom door opened and all three children tumbled out, having clearly been listening at the door. Thomas's face was bright with hope, Rebecca's cautiously optimistic, and Emma was clutching her doll and looking confused by all the tension. "Does this mean Mr. Barrett's staying?" Thomas asked, his voice carefully controlled like he was afraid of the answer. Nora looked at Luke, saw the question in his eyes, the quiet plea. She thought about the marshal's visit, about Caleb Stone and outlaws and all the reasonable fears that had kept her awake all night. Then she thought about Thomas learning to swing an axe, Rebecca's smile over a well-cooked meal, Emma's laughter when Luke carried her on his shoulders. She thought about not being alone anymore, about having someone to share the burden and the hope. "Yes," she said, and watched Luke's entire body relax. "Mr. Barrett's staying." Thomas whooped and ran to Luke, throwing his arms around him in a hug that the man returned with surprising gentleness. Rebecca smiled, soft and knowing, while Emma toddled over to demand her own hug. And Nora stood watching them all, this makeshift family that had formed in the space of 6 weeks, and felt something warm unfurl in her chest that might have been happiness, or might have been the beginning of something even more precious. The moment was shattered by another knock at the door, but this time it was lighter, less ominous. Luke tensed anyway, one hand dropping instinctively to his knife, but Nora moved past him and opened the door to find an older man in a worn coat holding his hat in weathered hands. "Mrs. Whitfield?" he said politely. "Name's Edward Chen. I own the general store in town. Sorry to intrude so early, but I heard you might be interested in some spring work." Nora blinked, confused. "Spring work?" "Yes, ma'am. See, my wife's been poorly this winter, and I'm looking for someone to help with the garden come planting season. Nothing fancy, just vegetables and herbs for the store. But I'd pay fair wages, and if your ranch could spare you a few days a week, I'd be grateful for the help." It took Nora a moment to process what he was saying. Work, paid work, the kind that would bring in money they desperately needed, money that could go toward the bank payment or seed or any of a dozen other necessities. "How much?" she asked, hope rising. "$1 a day, 3 days a week through the growing season. Call it $12 a month, April through September." Chen's lined face was kind. "I know it's not much, but combined with what your man there can make hiring out for ranch work around the territory, might help keep you afloat." Luke had come to stand behind Nora, his presence solid and reassuring. "She'll take it," he said, "and I'll hire out for spring roundup when the time comes. Between us, we'll make it work." Chen nodded, satisfied. "Good. My wife will be pleased. She's been worried about that garden something fierce. I'll come by in a few weeks when the ground thaws to discuss details, Mrs. Whitfield. Meanwhile, you folks take care." He departed as simply as he'd come, leaving Nora staring after him in wonder. "How did he know?" she asked. "How did he know we needed work?" "Small territory," Luke said. "Word gets around. Someone probably mentioned your situation, and Chen's a decent man. Decent people help when they can." It was such a simple statement, such an optimistic view of human nature, and it made Nora want to believe that maybe the world wasn't as hard and unforgiving as it had seemed these past months. Maybe there were still good people, still opportunities, still reasons to hope. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm, one that felt both familiar and entirely different from before. Luke's presence was no longer temporary but permanent, a fixture in their lives that everyone adjusted to with surprising ease. He moved his few belongings from the corner where he'd been sleeping to a space he partitioned off in the barn. "Not proper for me to be sleeping in the house now that it's a permanent arrangement," he'd said, despite Nora's protests that he'd freeze out there. But he'd made the barn space comfortable, even cozy, with a small stove he'd fashioned and insulated walls, and he seemed content with the arrangement. The work on the ranch continued with renewed energy now that there was no deadline hanging over them, no end date after which everything would revert to chaos. Luke finished the fence repairs and started on clearing the lower pasture, grubbing out stumps and rocks with Thomas's eager help. Rebecca took over more of the household management, freeing Nora to work on other projects, preserving what food they had, mending and making clothes, planning for the garden that Chen wanted planted. Even Emma contributed, gathering eggs from the chickens they'd managed to keep alive through winter, and helping Rebecca with simple cooking tasks. But more than the work, it was the small moments that changed things. The way Luke taught Thomas to read the weather by watching the sky and the animals. The way he listened to Rebecca's opinions about cooking and household management like they mattered. The way he carved little toys for Emma and told her stories by the fire on cold evenings. The way he looked at Nora sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, with an expression that made her heart skip and her breath catch. They didn't speak of what lay between them, that growing awareness that they were becoming something more than employer and employee, something more than friends. It was too new, too fragile, and besides, Nora was still technically in mourning. It wouldn't be proper to acknowledge feelings this soon after David's death, even if those feelings were becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. Then came the storm. It blew in on a Tuesday evening in late February, the sky turning an ominous greenish gray that Luke noticed immediately. "That's not good," he said, studying the horizon with narrowed eyes. "That's a bad one coming. We need to secure everything, barn, chicken coop, anything loose that could blow away." They worked frantically as the wind picked up, battling gusts that threatened to tear tools from their hands and slam doors into walls. The cattle were driven into the barn, the chickens secured in their reinforced coop, the wagon tied down with every rope they could find. By the time the first drops fell, fat and cold and hard as pebbles, they were all soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature. "Everyone inside," Luke ordered, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "Thomas, help your mother with the shutters. Rebecca, get extra candles and the emergency supplies. Emma, you stay in the middle of the cabin, away from the windows." They obeyed without question, recognizing the authority in his voice, the urgency. This was more than just a storm. This was the kind of weather that killed people, destroyed property, erased months of hard work in a single night. Nora had seen it before. The sudden violent storms that rolled across the plains with no warning and no mercy. The storm hit with the force of a physical blow, rain turning to hail that hammered the roof like bullets. The wind screamed around the cabin, finding every crack and gap, making the walls shudder and groan. They huddled together in the main room, Luke having come in from the barn at Nora's insistence, all of them watching the ceiling and praying it would hold. "Tell us a story, Mr. Barrett," Emma said in a small voice, pressing close to his side. "Like you do sometimes. Tell us a story so we don't have to hear the wind." Luke gathered the child onto his lap and began to spin a tale of brave knights and clever princesses, his voice steady and calm even as the storm raged. Thomas and Rebecca leaned in to listen, and Nora found herself doing the same, letting Luke's words build a cocoon of safety around them all. He was good at this, she realized, good at making people feel secure even when everything was falling apart, good at being the solid center that others could cling to. The storm lasted through the night, finally exhausting itself near dawn. When the first gray light filtered through the shutters, Luke was the first to venture outside, with Thomas right behind him despite Nora's protests. She stood at the door with the girls, watching as they surveyed the damage. It could have been worse, much worse. The barn roof had lost some shingles but held overall. The chicken coop was intact. The wagon had stayed tied down, but the newly repaired fence line on the eastern pasture was down, rails scattered across the muddy ground like matchsticks. And when Luke checked the barn more thoroughly, he came back to the cabin with his jaw set tight. "What is it?" Nora asked, reading disaster in his face. "The roof's damaged worse than I thought. There's a leak over where the cattle are sheltered. If we don't fix it soon, the whole section will rot through, and then we'll lose the barn entirely." "Can you fix it?" "I can try," Luke said, "but I'll need materials, shingles, nails, tar for waterproofing, and I'll need help. It's a two-man job at minimum, and Thomas is still too young for roof work." "How much will the materials cost?" Luke named a figure that made Nora's heart sink. $20. $20 they'd need to save for the bank payment, $20 they couldn't spare. "We'll figure it out," she said with more confidence than she felt. "We always do." But figuring it out proved harder than expected. Luke rode into town the next day to price materials and came back with bad news. The storm had damaged half the buildings in the territory, and prices had skyrocketed with the sudden demand. What should have cost $20 now cost $40, and there was a waiting list for repairs that stretched into April. "We can't wait that long," Nora said, staring at the numbers Luke had written down. "By April, the barn will be ruined." "I know." Luke rubbed his face wearily. I could try to do it myself without help, but it's dangerous. If I fall, you're not doing it alone, Nora said sharply. I won't have you risking your neck because we can't afford proper help. Then what do you suggest? Nora didn't have an answer. They sat in silence, the weight of the problem pressing down on them, when Thomas spoke up from the corner where he'd been listening. What about Mr. Crow? Both adults turned to stare at him. What about him? Nora asked carefully. He's got materials, doesn't he? And workers. Papa used to say Crow had a whole crew of carpenters and builders for his ranch. Maybe he'd loan us what we need just until we can pay him back. Thomas, Mr. Crow would never— He might if Mr. Barrett asked, Thomas insisted. Man to man, I mean. Not you, Mama, because he doesn't respect you. But Mr. Barrett's different. He stood up to Crow before, remember? Maybe Crow would listen to him. It was a terrible idea, Nora thought. Putting themselves in debt to Silas Crow was just asking for trouble. But as she looked at Luke's thoughtful expression, she realized he was actually considering it. Absolutely not, she said firmly. I won't be beholden to that man, not for anything. It wouldn't be beholden, Luke said slowly. It'd be a business transaction. We borrow materials, we pay him back with interest. Standard arrangement. Crow doesn't make standard arrangements. He makes traps disguised as generosity, and then he springs them when you're most vulnerable. Maybe, Luke allowed, but what choice do we have? The barn's essential and we can't afford to fix it any other way. They argued about it through the evening, Nora adamant that they find another solution, Luke calmly pointing out that there wasn't one. Finally, exhausted and out of options, Nora agreed, but only if she went with Luke to make the request, only if everything was documented in writing, and only if they had a clear repayment plan that didn't put the ranch itself at risk. The next morning, they rode together to the Double C Ranch, leaving the children with strict instructions to stay inside and keep the doors locked. Crow's spread was everything their ranch wasn't: prosperous, well-maintained, sprawling across prime grazing land, with buildings that looked more like a small town than a working ranch. As they rode up the long drive, Nora felt her courage falter. What were they doing here, begging from a man who'd made it clear he wanted them to fail? But Luke seemed untroubled, his bearing confident as he dismounted and helped Nora down. When a ranch hand directed them to the main house, Luke knocked firmly and waited until Crow himself answered, clearly surprised to find them on his doorstep. Mrs. Whitfield, Mr. Barrett. Crow's smile was more puzzled than predatory. What brings you out here? We need to talk business, Luke said simply. Got a few minutes? Crow studied them both, then stepped aside. Come in. Can I offer you coffee? The house was as impressive inside as out. Rich furniture, expensive rugs, artwork on the walls. It was a statement of wealth and power, and Nora felt acutely aware of her threadbare coat and worn boots. But Luke seemed unbothered, settling into a chair like he belonged there and accepting the coffee Crow poured. So, Crow said, sitting across from them. Business. I'm intrigued. But Luke laid out the situation concisely. The storm damage, the need for materials, the inflated prices, and long waits. He proposed borrowing what they needed with repayment over 6 months at reasonable interest, offering a promissory note backed by the ranch's timber rights as collateral. Crow listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Luke finished, there was a long silence. You're asking me to help save the ranch I've been trying to buy for months, Crow finally said, amusement coloring his tone. That seems counterproductive to my interests, don't you think? Maybe, Luke said. Or maybe it's smart business. We're offering fair interest, and you've got materials sitting in your warehouse that aren't doing anyone any good. Plus, if we succeed, and we will, you've got a functioning ranch next door instead of a foreclosed property that'll probably just attract squatters and trouble. And if you fail, if you default on the loan and I have to claim the timber rights, then you've got valuable timber rights, and you're still ahead, Luke said calmly. Either way, you win. Question is whether you win a little or whether you win while also establishing yourself as someone who helps neighbors in need. Reputation matters in this territory, Mr. Crow. Being known as a man who only kicks people when they're down, that's one kind of reputation. Being known as someone who's tough but fair when approached honestly, that's another kind entirely. Nora held her breath, watching Crow's face, seeing the calculation there. Luke had played it perfectly, she realized. appealing to both Crow's self-interest and his vanity, making him feel like the generous benefactor while also making it clear that generosity would serve his purposes. 6 months repayment, Crow said slowly, at 10% interest. And if you default, I get timber rights to your entire back 40, not just enough to cover the debt. That's robbery, Nora said sharply, but Luke put a hand on her arm. 8% interest, he countered, and timber rights proportional to the actual debt if we default. I won't agree to hand over more than we owe. They haggled for another 20 minutes, finally settling on 8.5% interest with proportional collateral and a provision that if they paid early, the interest would be reduced accordingly. Crow had his lawyer draw up the papers right there, and Luke read every word carefully before signing, making Crow add clauses that protected them from hidden fees or early call provisions. When it was done, they walked out with a letter of credit for materials and an agreement that Crow would send 2 of his workers to help with the roof repair, deducting their wages from the total owed. I can't believe that worked, Nora said quietly as they rode away. I can't believe he actually helped us. He helped himself, Luke corrected. We just made it easy for him to do it. And now we've got what we need to save the barn, plus we've established that we can negotiate with him on equal terms. That matters, Mrs. Whitfield. Next time he tries to push you around, he'll remember that you're not someone who can be bullied. We, Nora said softly. Not me. We're not someone who can be bullied. Luke smiled, and it was the warmest expression she'd ever seen on his face. We, he agreed, together. The roof repair took a week with Crow's workers helping, and when it was finished, the barn was stronger than it had been even before the storm. Luke supervised the work with quiet authority, earning the grudging respect of Crow's men, who'd clearly expected some incompetent drifter but found instead someone who knew what he was doing and wasn't afraid to work harder than anyone else. On the last day of February, Nora made the journey to Helena with Luke beside her, carrying the bank payment in a leather pouch strapped under her coat. $260 scraped together from timber sales and savings and careful management. It was enough. Barely, but enough. Mr. Kemp accepted the payment with surprise that bordered on disappointment. He'd clearly expected to foreclose and make a tidy profit selling the property to Crow. But money was money, and he had no legal grounds to refuse it. He marked the note paid, returned the deed to Nora's shaking hands, and they were done. The ranch was theirs, free and clear of the bank's claim. They celebrated that night with a feast, chicken that Luke had slaughtered that morning, vegetables from their dwindling stores, biscuits with butter and honey, and even a small cake that Rebecca had secretly prepared. The children were giddy with relief and happiness, their laughter filling the cabin in a way it hadn't since before David died. And when the children were finally asleep, Nora and Luke sat by the fire as had become their habit, not speaking, just existing together in comfortable silence. But tonight felt different, weighted with things unsaid, with awareness that they'd crossed some invisible threshold. "We did it," Nora finally said. "We actually saved the ranch." "You did it," Luke corrected gently. "You kept fighting when most people would have given up. I just helped." "You did more than help." Nora turned to look at him, really look at him. This man who'd wandered into her life at its darkest moment and somehow become essential to everything good that followed. "You saved us, Luke. Not just the ranch. Us. Me and my children. We were dying slowly, and you gave us reasons to live again." Luke was quiet for a long moment, firelight playing across his weathered face. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "You saved me too, Nora. You just don't know it yet." He'd never called her by her first name before, and the sound of it on his lips sent warmth flooding through her chest. She knew she should look away, should maintain the proper distance, should remember that it had only been 4 months since David died. But she didn't want to look away. Didn't want distance. Didn't want to pretend that what she felt for Luke Barrett was anything less than the fierce, complicated tangle of gratitude and respect, and something that was starting to feel dangerously like love. "Luke," she started, but didn't know how to finish, didn't know how to put into words everything she was feeling, the fear and the hope and the cautious joy of discovering that life could offer second chances even when you thought you'd used up all your luck. He seemed to understand anyway. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and solid, and Nora felt tears prick her eyes at the simple comfort of human touch, of connection with someone who understood her struggles because he'd lived them alongside her. "We don't have to name this," Luke said quietly. "We don't have to decide what it means or where it's going. We can just be together and see what happens." "Is that enough for you?" Nora asked. "Just being? When you could right away find something easier, someone less complicated?" "There's nothing easy about me either," Luke reminded her with a faint smile. "Outlaw brother, dangerous past, remember? If anything, you're the one taking the bigger risk here." "Then we're both foolish," Nora said, but she was smiling too, and her hand tightened in his. "Probably," Luke agreed, "but I'd rather be foolish with you than wise and alone." Outside, the Montana winter was slowly surrendering to the first hints of spring. Inside the cabin, two people who'd been alone sat together by firelight, their hands joined, their futures uncertain, but somehow less frightening because they'd face whatever came together. And in the corner where the children slept, three young hearts rested easy, knowing that the hunger and fear that had haunted them was finally past. Spring came to Montana territory like a whispered promise, gradually becoming truth. The snow retreated inch by stubborn inch, revealing brown earth that would soon turn green, and the creek that had been frozen solid began to run again with a sound like laughter. The cattle grew restless in their winter confinement, sensing the change in the air, and the chickens began laying with renewed enthusiasm. It was as if the land itself was waking up, shaking off the long cold sleep, and remembering what it meant to be alive. Nora woke one morning in early March to find Luke already outside, standing in the middle of what would be their vegetable garden, his face turned toward the rising sun. She watched him from the window as she braided her hair, struck by how completely he'd become part of this place, part of their lives. He moved through the ranch with the easy confidence of someone who belonged, who'd put down roots without even realizing it. The restlessness that had driven him to her door that frozen February night seemed to have left him entirely, replaced by something that looked remarkably like contentment. She was just finishing breakfast preparations when he came in, bringing the smell of morning air with him, his cheeks ruddy from the cold that still lingered in the early hours. "Ground's starting to thaw," he announced, accepting the coffee she poured for him. "Another week or two and we can start planting. I was thinking we should expand the garden this year, not just for Chen's store, but for ourselves too. Plant enough that we can preserve for next winter, maybe even have surplus to sell." "That's ambitious," Nora said, but she was smiling. Everything Luke did was ambitious, driven by an optimism that she was learning to trust. "We'll need seeds and fertilizer, and—" "I made a list." Luke pulled a folded paper from his pocket, covered in his careful handwriting. "Figured we could place an order with Chen when you start working for him next month. He said he'd give us cost price on supplies if we're doing volume." Thomas emerged from his sleeping corner, drawn by the sound of voices and the smell of coffee that he was now allowed to drink in small, heavily sweetened doses. "Are we really going to plant that much?" he asked, peering at Luke's list. "That's enough for 3 families." "That's the point," Luke said. "We grow more than we need, preserve what we can't eat fresh, and sell the surplus. It's how successful ranches work. Multiple income streams, cattle, crops, hired labor, anything that brings in money. That way, if one thing fails, you've got others to fall back on." Rebecca, who'd been listening from where she was kneading bread dough, spoke up. "Papa used to say we should focus on cattle. The crops were too risky with the weather." "Your father wasn't wrong," Luke said carefully. He was always respectful when the children mentioned David, never trying to replace him or diminish his memory. Cattle should be the foundation, but that doesn't mean we ignore other opportunities, especially when those opportunities could mean the difference between barely surviving and actually thriving. Emma wandered over and climbed into Luke's lap with the unselfconscious affection of a child who'd found someone safe to love. He adjusted her absently, continuing to discuss planting schedules with Thomas, while Emma played with the buttons on his shirt. Nora felt her heart swell watching them. This man who'd claimed to know nothing about being part of a family, but who'd somehow figured it out anyway, who gave her children the attention and affection they'd been starving for. The morning routine unfolded with the comfortable rhythm they'd developed over the weeks. Luke and Thomas headed out to check fences and move the cattle to fresh grazing. Rebecca took charge of the housework with Emma's enthusiastic, if not always helpful, assistance, and Nora settled into mending and planning. But her mind kept drifting to Luke, to the way he'd looked at her the night they'd paid off the bank, to the feeling of his hand in hers and the words they'd exchanged by firelight. They hadn't spoken of it since, hadn't acknowledged the shift in their relationship or put a name to what was growing between them. Life had simply continued, but with an undercurrent of awareness that colored every interaction, every glance, every accidental touch. Nora knew the children had noticed. Rebecca's knowing looks made that clear. But no one said anything directly. They were all dancing around something too precious and fragile to name, afraid that speaking it aloud might break the spell. It was Edward Chen who forced the issue, quite by accident, when he came by the following week to discuss the garden work. He brought his wife Martha with him, a small bird-like woman who'd been ill all winter but was clearly on the mend, and they sat in Nora's kitchen drinking coffee and talking about soil composition and planting schedules. "It's good to see you looking so well, Nora," Martha said warmly. "We were all so worried about you after David passed, but you've clearly managed beautifully." Her eyes flicked meaningfully toward the window where Luke and Thomas could be seen working on the fence line. "Found yourself good help." "Mr. Barrett has been invaluable," Nora said carefully, hearing the question beneath Martha's words. "I'm sure he has." Martha's smile was kind but knowing. "Edward tells me he negotiated with Silas Crow like a seasoned businessman. That takes courage, standing up to Crow. And skill. Your Mr. Barrett must be quite remarkable. He's not—" Nora started, then stopped, unsure how to finish. "He's not my Mr. Barrett." Sounded like a denial of something that was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. "He's been very good to us," she finished lamely. Martha reached across the table and patted Nora's hand. "Dear, everyone in the territory knows what Luke Barrett's done for you and your children, and everyone thinks it's wonderful. No one expects you to mourn forever, you know. David was a good man, but he'd want you to be happy, to find companionship, to build a new life if the opportunity presented itself." "It's only been 4 months," Nora said quietly. "People will talk." "People always talk," Martha said with a dismissive wave. "Let them. You know what I see when I look at you now? I see a woman who's found her strength again. A woman who's not just surviving, but living. If Luke Barrett had anything to do with that, and I suspect he had quite a lot to do with it, then anyone who'd judge you for it isn't worth your concern." The words stayed with Nora long after the Chens departed, rattling around in her head as she went about her afternoon work. Martha was right, of course. Life was too short and too hard to waste on worrying about what small-minded people might whisper. But knowing that intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two different things. She'd been raised to believe in propriety, in appropriate mourning periods, in the careful observation of social conventions. Throwing all that aside for Luke Barrett felt reckless and dangerous and exhilarating all at once. That evening, after the children were in bed, she found Luke in the barn checking on a cow that was close to calving. He was murmuring to the animal in a low, soothing voice, his hands gentle as he examined her. Nora stood in the doorway watching him, struck by the tenderness in someone who'd seemed so hard and guarded when she'd first met him. "Is she all right?" Nora asked, stepping into the warm dimness of the barn. Luke looked up, surprise and pleasure crossing his face. "She's fine. Should drop the calf in the next day or two. I'm just keeping an eye on her." He straightened, brushing straw from his pants. "Everything all right at the house?" "Everything's fine." Nora moved closer, her heart beating faster than the simple conversation warranted. "I wanted to talk to you about us." Luke went very still, and Nora could see the wariness in his eyes, the fear that she was about to pull away, to re-establish the boundaries they'd been blurring for weeks. "All right," he said carefully. "Martha Chen said something today," Nora began, then stopped, trying to find the right words. "She said that everyone in the territory knows what you've done for us, what you mean to us. And she said that no one would judge us, if this became something more than just a working arrangement. And what do you think?" Luke asked quietly. "Does it matter what the territory thinks, or does it only matter what you think?" "Both," Nora admitted. "I'd be lying if I said I didn't care about propriety, about what's appropriate, But I'd also be lying if I said that was more important than... She faltered, then pushed forward. Than what I feel when I look at you. Than the way my children light up when you walk in the room. Than the fact that I can't imagine this ranch, this life, without you in it anymore. Luke closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "Nora," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "I have been halfway in love with you since the night you shared your last meal with a stranger who didn't deserve your kindness. And every day since then I've fallen a little more. I know it's too soon, I know it's complicated, but I can't help what I feel, and I don't want to anymore." "It is too soon," Nora whispered, but her hands had come up to rest on his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and steady beneath her palms. "David's only been gone 4 months. People can say what they like," Luke interrupted gently. "You loved your husband. I know that. And you're allowed to grieve him for as long as you need. But you're also allowed to keep living, Nora. To find happiness again. To accept that life gives us second chances sometimes, and we don't have to apologize for taking them." Nora felt tears spill over, running hot down her cheeks. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "Don't know how to let go of the past and reach for the future at the same time." "You do it one day at a time," Luke said, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "You do it by accepting that you can honor what was while still embracing what is. David was your past, and he'll always be part of your children's lives, part of this ranch's history. But I want to be your future, Nora. I want to be the man who stands beside you through whatever comes next, if you'll have me." "The children," Nora said, grasping for practical concerns because the emotion was too overwhelming. "We'd need to think about them, about what this means for them." "The children adore you, and they trust me," Luke said. "Together we can give them a stable home, a real family. Isn't that what matters most?" He was right, Nora knew. Everything he was saying was right. But knowing something and accepting it were 2 different things, and the gap between them felt impossibly wide. She stood there in the barn, Luke's hands warm on her face, and felt herself balanced on a knife's edge between fear and hope. Then Emma's voice called out from the house, "Mama, Mama, where are you?" And the moment shattered. Nora stepped back, immediately shifting into the mother role that was so much easier than navigating these complicated adult emotions. "I have to go," she said. "Emma probably had a bad dream. She's been having them lately." Luke let her go without protest, but his eyes held a question that Nora wasn't ready to answer. She hurried back to the house, back to the simple problem of a frightened child that could be solved with hugs and soothing words, back to the life she knew how to navigate. Behind her, in the barn, Luke stood alone and wondered if he'd pushed too hard, asked for too much, scared away the only good thing he'd found in 3 years of drifting. But the next morning, when Nora came out to draw water from the well, she found a small carved locket hanging from the pump handle. It was made of smooth pine, carefully sanded and polished, with 3 tiny initials carved into the wood, T, R, and E. Thomas, Rebecca, Emma. Her children's initials preserved in wood by a man who understood that loving her meant loving them too, that they were a package that couldn't be separated. Nora held the locket for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, the meaning. Then she tucked it inside her dress, close to her heart, and went to find Luke. He was in the lower pasture with Thomas, the 2 of them clearing rocks from the field that would need plowing soon. Nora walked across the still damp ground, her skirts heavy with morning dew, until she stood close enough to speak without Thomas overhearing. "Thank you," she said simply, touching the place where the locket rested beneath her bodice. "It's beautiful." Luke's face softened with relief. "You like it?" "I love it." Nora glanced at Thomas, who was studiously pretending not to notice their conversation, then back at Luke. "And I've been thinking about what you said last night, about second chances and futures. I think I'd like to try, if you're patient with me, if you understand that I might move slowly, that I might be afraid sometimes." "I can be patient," Luke said quietly. "I can be whatever you need me to be, Nora." "What I need," Nora said, "is for you to be exactly who you are. No more, no less. Just stay with us. Help us build something that lasts." "I'm not going anywhere," Luke promised, and the certainty in his voice made Nora believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. The weeks that followed were a study in careful progression, in testing boundaries and building trust. Luke and Nora moved through their days with a new awareness of each other, finding excuses for small touches. Hands brushing as they passed tools, shoulders bumping as they worked side by side. The occasional deliberate press of palm to palm that spoke of promises not yet made, but deeply felt. The children noticed, of course, and reacted with the uncomplicated joy of young people who wanted their mother to be happy. "Are you and Mr. Barrett courting?" Rebecca asked one afternoon while they were planting seeds in the garden that would supply Chen's store. "Because if you are, I think it's wonderful. He's kind, and he works hard, and he makes you smile again." Nora felt her face heat. "Is it that obvious?" "To anyone with eyes," Rebecca said matter-of-factly, "Thomas thinks it's perfect. He's already calling Mr. Barrett almost Pa when you're not around. And Emma follows him everywhere like he's the most fascinating person she's ever met." "And you?" Nora asked carefully. "What do you think, Becca?" Rebecca was quiet for a moment, her hands stilling in the dirt. "I think Papa would approve," she finally said. "I think he'd be glad you found someone good, someone who treats us well. And I think Mr. Barrett makes our family feel complete again. So yes, Mama, I think it's wonderful." The endorsement from her oldest daughter, her most perceptive child, meant more than Nora could express. She pulled Rebecca into a hug, dirt and all, and let herself believe that maybe this really could work, that maybe love the second time around didn't diminish what came before, but instead honored it by showing that hope could survive even the hardest losses. It was mid-April when trouble finally arrived in the form of Caleb Stone. Nora was working in the garden with Rebecca when she saw the three riders approaching. Large men on large horses, moving with the kind of casual arrogance that spoke of people who'd rarely met resistance. Luke was in the barn, and Thomas had ridden into town for supplies, leaving the ranch dangerously undermanned if this was the confrontation they'd been dreading. "Rebecca, take Emma and go inside," Nora said quietly. "Lock the door. Don't come out no matter what you hear." "Mama, now, Becca, please." Rebecca gathered Emma and hurried to the cabin while Nora stood and faced the approaching riders, wiping her hands on her apron and praying Luke would sense something was wrong. The lead rider was a bear of a man with a livid scar running from temple to jaw. Caleb Stone, she assumed, the ghost from Luke's past finally made flesh. They reined in at the garden's edge, their horses trampling freshly planted rows, and Stone looked down at her with eyes that held no warmth, no humanity. "Mrs. Whitfield, I presume." "This is my property," Nora said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "State your business, or leave." "My business is with Luke Barrett," Stone said, swinging down from his horse with surprising grace for a man his size. "I'm told he's working here. I need to speak with him about a matter of family debt." "Mr. Barrett doesn't owe you anything," Nora said. "Whatever business you think you have with him, you're mistaken." Stone smiled, showing teeth that had been broken and poorly mended. "See, that's where you're wrong, lady. Luke Barrett's brother owes me $500. And when family members can't pay, the debt transfers. That's how it works in my world." "That's not how it works in the law," Nora countered. "One man's debts are his own. They don't pass to his relatives." "The law," Stone said dismissively, taking a step closer. "Out here, I am the law, Mrs. Whitfield. And I say Luke Barrett owes me money, or he owes me information about where I can find his brother. One or the other will settle the matter." "He has neither," came Luke's voice from behind Stone, calm and level. Nora looked past the big man to see Luke standing in the barn doorway, his rifle held loosely in one hand, not quite pointed at anyone, but ready. "I told you and Helena, Caleb, I don't have your money and I don't know where William is. Coming here was a waste of your time." Stone turned slowly, his scarred face splitting into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Luke Barrett, been a long time. You've aged well. Hard living suits you." His eyes flicked to Nora, then back to Luke with new understanding. "Playing house now, are we? Got yourself a pretty widow and some ready-made kids? That's convenient." "Leave Mrs. Whitfield out of this," Luke said, his voice hardening. Your business is with me, so let's conduct it somewhere else, away from here. Why? Because you don't want your new family seeing who you really are? Stone laughed, an ugly sound. Or maybe you're worried they'll get caught in the crossfire when this goes bad. There's not going to be any crossfire, Luke said, because you're going to get back on your horse and ride away. I don't have what you want, Caleb. Hurting me won't change that. And I'm guessing Marshal Dixon made it clear that causing trouble in the territory would be a bad idea for your health. Dixon's in Helena, Stone said. We're a long ride from Helena. Lot can happen between here and there. The two men stood facing each other across the trampled garden, and Nora could feel the violence building between them like a thunderstorm gathering strength. She wanted to run, to grab her children and hide, but her feet seemed rooted to the ground. This was Luke's past finally catching up to him, the danger he'd warned her about manifesting in boots and scarred flesh and barely leashed menace. Last chance, Luke said quietly. Right away, Caleb. Find William on your own. Leave us out of it. Can't do that, Stone replied. You see, I need to make an example. Need people to know that debts get paid one way or another. And if I can't get the money from William, I'll get it from you, even if I have to burn this ranch down and sell the land to pay what's owed. Luke's hands tightened on his rifle, and Nora saw murder flash across his face, brief but unmistakable. Then, almost imperceptibly, his body relaxed and his expression cleared. You know what your problem is, Caleb? You think everyone's alone like you. You think because William ran out on his debts and I left Missouri that we're all just drifters with no connections, no one to stand for us. But you're wrong. As if orchestrated, Thomas chose that moment to return from town, the wagon rolling up the drive with surprising speed. But he wasn't alone. Marshal Dixon sat beside him, looking grim and purposeful, and behind the wagon rode 6 men Nora recognized as neighboring ranchers, all armed, all watching Stone and his companions with expressions that promised violence if it became necessary. Mr. Stone, Dixon said, dismounting with careful casualness. Thought I might find you here. Funny thing happened after you left Helena. 3 men reported seeing you and your friends threatening law-abiding citizens, extracting debts that aren't legally collectible. Now, I'm willing to overlook what you do in other territories, but this is my jurisdiction. And in my jurisdiction, we follow actual law, not whatever system you've invented to justify robbery. Stone's confidence flickered, but didn't break. I'm just here to talk to an old friend, Marshal. Nothing illegal about that. Trespassing's illegal, said one of the ranchers. Edward Chen, Nora realized with shock. Damaging property is illegal. And making threats is definitely illegal. Seems to me you've broken at least 3 laws in the last 5 minutes. Plus, I've got a warrant here for your brother's arrest, Dixon added, pulling a paper from his coat. Not for you, Mr. Stone. For William Barrett, on charges of robbery in 3 counties. Now, if you were to have information about his whereabouts, that'd be valuable. Might even be worth a reward. But extorting Luke Barrett, who hasn't seen his brother in 3 years and has been working an honest job here, that's just going to land you in my jail. Nora watched the calculation happen in Stone's eyes, saw him weighing his options and coming up empty. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outthought. Whatever power he'd held in other places didn't extend here, where Luke had allies and Dixon had authority. This isn't over, Stone finally said, swinging back onto his horse. Debts don't disappear, Barrett. Sooner or later, you'll pay. The only debt here is the one William owes, Luke said firmly. And when you find him, if you find him, you can collect it from him directly. But I'm done running from his mistakes, Caleb. I've got a life here now, people who depend on me, and I'm not letting you or William or anyone else destroy that. Stone stared at him for a long moment, then spat in the dirt and wheeled his horse around. His 2 companions followed, and they rode off at a gallop, leaving trampled plants and crushed hope in their wake. When they were gone, Nora found her legs would no longer support her and sat down hard in the dirt. Luke was beside her instantly, his rifle set aside, his hands checking her for injury even though Stone had never touched her. Are you all right? Did he hurt you? Nora, talk to me. I'm fine, she managed, though her voice was shaking. Just scared. I thought... I know, Luke said, pulling her against his chest, despite the audience of ranchers and lawmen. I know, and I'm sorry. I should have been here. Should have been watching. How did you know to come? Nora asked, looking over Luke's shoulder at Thomas, who was climbing down from the wagon with a grin that was equal parts proud and relieved. I saw them on the road, Thomas explained. Recognized Stone from Helena, so I rode straight to Marshal Dixon's office instead of the general store. Figured if there was going to be trouble, we'd need the law on our side. Smart thinking, Luke said, his voice thick with emotion. You did good, Thomas. Real good. Dixon cleared his throat. Mr. Barrett, I'm going to need a statement from you about William's whereabouts, if you know anything. And I'll be keeping an eye out for Stone. He's not welcome in my territory if he can't behave himself. But for now, I think the immediate danger's past. They spent the next hour giving statements and thanking the neighboring ranchers who'd ridden to their aid, men Nora had barely spoken to in the years since David's death, but who'd come anyway because Luke had earned their respect and because, in the hard country of Montana Territory, you helped your neighbors when trouble came calling. When everyone had finally departed and the ranch was quiet again, Nora gathered her children close and let herself shake with reaction. It was over. The threat from Luke's past had manifested and been defeated, not through violence but through community, through the connections Luke had built and the reputation he'd earned. He wasn't alone anymore, and neither was she. They were part of something larger now, woven into the fabric of the territory in a way that made them stronger than either could have been separately. That night, after the children were asleep, Luke found Nora on the porch, staring out at the darkness and trying to process everything that had happened. I meant what I said to Stone, he told her quietly. I'm done running, done letting William's mistakes define my life, and I'm done pretending I don't know where I belong. He took a breath, then continued in a rush. Marry me, Nora. Not because it's practical or convenient, but because I love you. Because I want to spend every day for the rest of my life making you happy, helping you raise your children, building a future together. I know it's soon. I know people will talk. But I also know that life's too short and too uncertain to waste time on what we're supposed to do instead of what we want to do. So marry me. Please. Nora turned to look at him. This man who'd wandered into her life when she'd had nothing left to offer, and who'd stayed anyway, who'd taught her that strength could be gentle and that asking for help wasn't weakness. She thought about David, about the love they'd shared and the life they'd built, and she felt no guilt in acknowledging that lightning could strike twice, that hearts could mend and love again. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. Luke's face split into a grin of pure joy, and he pulled her into a kiss that tasted of promise and hope and all the tomorrows they'd build together. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, Nora rested her forehead against his and said, "The children should be there. When we do this, they should be part of it." Of course they will, Luke said. They're the reason I fell in love with you in the first place. Seeing you fight so hard to protect them, to give them a future. They're part of us, Nora, always. They married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in town, with Thomas standing proudly as Luke's best man, and Rebecca and Emma dressed in new dresses that Martha Chen had helped sew. Edward Chen gave Nora away, and Marshal Dixon stood witness, and half the territory showed up to celebrate the union of the widow who'd refused to quit and the drifter who'd finally found home. Silas Crow even made an appearance, bringing a wedding gift of breeding stock, 2 young heifers that would help rebuild the ranch's herd. Consider it an investment, he'd said gruffly. Neighbors help neighbors, and you've proven you're the kind of neighbors worth having. The years that followed were not without struggle. Ranching never was, and Montana's weather remained as unpredictable and unforgiving as ever. But they faced everything together, building the ranch into something David would have been proud of, something that would sustain not just one generation, but many. Thomas grew into a fine rancher in his own right, learning everything Luke could teach him and adding innovations of his own. Rebecca married a young banker from Helena and brought modern business practices to the ranch's operations. And Emma, who'd been so small and frightened that frozen winter, grew into a woman with her mother's determination and her almost father's steady kindness. Luke and Nora added 2 children of their own to the family, a daughter named Sarah after Nora's mother, and a son they named David in honor of the man whose death had paradoxically brought them together. The 5 children grew up knowing they were all equally loved, that family wasn't just blood, but choice, and commitment and the daily decision to stand together against whatever the world threw at them. On their 10th anniversary, Nora and Luke stood on the porch of the ranch house they'd expanded and improved, watching the sun set over land that was finally, fully theirs. The banknote had been paid off years ago, and the debt to Crow settled with interest. The fences were strong, the cattle healthy, the fields productive. They'd built something that would last, something that mattered. "Remember the night we met?" Luke asked, his arm around Nora's shoulders. "You were so thin I could count your ribs, and you lied about having enough to eat. And you pretended your horse was carrying too much weight so you could give us your supplies without hurting my pride," Nora replied with a smile. "We were both such liars that night." "Maybe," Luke agreed. "Or maybe we were just two people too stubborn to give up, who recognized something in each other worth fighting for." "You said I'd eat beside you from now on," Nora remembered. "That first night when you realized how bad things were. You said, 'Then you'll eat beside me from now on.'" "And have you?" Luke asked, pulling her closer. "Been eating beside me all these years?" Nora laughed, the sound carrying across the ranch they'd saved together, across the life they'd built from hunger and desperation and the stubborn refusal to let hardship win. "Every day," she said. "Every single day, Luke Barrett, and I plan to keep doing it for as long as God gives us." "That's good," Luke said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Because I've got nowhere else I'd rather be than right here, beside you, watching what we built together grow and thrive." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson, they stood together in the gathering dusk, two people who'd been broken and alone, who'd found each other at the moment they'd needed it most, who'd proven that sometimes the best things in life come not from careful planning, but from random acts of kindness that bloom into something no one could have predicted. The wind that had once howled with hunger and despair now whispered of plenty and promise, carrying the sounds of their children's laughter and the lowing of cattle and all the small, precious noises of a life well lived. And in the distance, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the echo of that first knock on a desperate woman's door, the moment when everything changed, when a stranger asked for water and received so much more: home, family, love, and the second chance they'd both needed but neither had dared hope for. From hunger to hope, from despair to joy, from then to now, and on into all the tomorrows that stretched before them like the endless Montana sky, this was their story, and it was finally, beautifully complete.